In 1950, the average American family car took nearly 20 seconds to hit 60 miles per hour. That was just the reality of the time: underpowered engines, outdated gearboxes, and cars that weighed a ton. Americans drove, but nobody was calling it fast, and that stayed the same right up until Detroit made up its mind to change everything. In 1948, NASCAR came along. Americans packed the stands watching Chryslers and Pontiacs blast around the track. Then on weekends they walked into their local dealership and bought the street version of those same cars. Detroit read that signal loud and clear. Chrysler pushed the horsepower numbers up. GM pushed back. Ford refused to sit on the sidelines. Then in 1956, Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act, and 41,000 miles of highway started getting laid down across the country, giving Detroit one more reason to build something more aggressive than anything that had come before. Every car on today's list is a genuine production vehicle, verified by major automotive publications or timed at official speed events. 1955 Ford Thunderbird. On February 20, 1954, Ford unveiled the Thunderbird at the Detroit Auto Show. The first car rolled off the production line on September 9th of that year, and it went on sale to the public in October as a 1955 model. In the first 10 days alone, more than 3,500 orders came in. Ford had projected sales of around 10,000 units for the first year. The final number was 16,155. While Chevrolet managed to sell just 674 Corvettes that same year. Under the hood was a Y-block V8 displacing 292 cubic inches, rated at 193 horsepower with the manual transmission, or 198 horsepower paired with the Ford O-Matic automatic. That was enough to get the car to 60 miles per hour in roughly 8.9 seconds with a top speed of around 112 miles per hour. For an American family car in 1955, those were genuinely impressive numbers. But the T-Bird's appeal never came down to straight-line speed alone. Ford didn't call it a sports car, they called it a personal car of distinction. The Corvette at the time still had that stripped-down race car feel to it, while the T-Bird showed up with leather seating, optional air conditioning, and enough comfort for two people to actually enjoy a long drive. The starting price was $2,695, just enough to make middle-class Americans think twice and then say yes. Ford converted the Thunderbird to a four-seater starting in 1958, and the original two-seat version from 1955 through 1957 remains one of the most sought-after collector cars of the entire decade. 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air. That same year, Chevrolet pulled off something that nobody in Detroit saw coming. They dropped one of the most important engines in American automotive history into a perfectly ordinary family car and sold the whole package for under $2,000. The car was the Bel Air, and the engine was the small block V8, displacing 265 cubic inches. A completely new design that was lighter, more efficient, and powerful enough to open up an entirely different era for Chevrolet. Engineer Ed Cole was the man behind it, spending months convincing GM's leadership to sign off before he finally got the green light. The base version put out 162 horsepower with a two-barrel carburetor. The Power Pack option with a four-barrel carburetor pushed that up to 180 horsepower, and by the end of the year, the Super Power Pack took it to 195. Popular Mechanics clocked the base V8 version at 12.9 seconds to 60 miles per hour, but the Power Pack trim cut that down to somewhere between 8 and 8.5 seconds, with a quarter-mile time of 16.9 seconds. Before 1955, getting that kind of performance out of a car meant either spending serious money on something upscale or building it yourself from scratch. The Bel Air was the first time an ordinary American could walk into a dealership, pay an ordinary price, and drive home in something that was genuinely quick. Motor Trend handed the Bel Air its highest marks for ride and handling that year. GM ran ads calling it the hot one, and the buying public agreed without hesitation. Chevrolet moved 770,955 Bel Airs in 1955, making it the top-selling car brand in America that year. The 265 small block that powered the Bel Air became the foundation for dozens of Chevrolet Fiv 8 generations that followed. 70 years later, that same basic architecture is still being developed and refined. Very few engines in the history of the automobile can say the same thing. 1956, DeSoto Adventurer. Most Americans today hear the name DeSoto and have to stop for a second to remember what it even was. DeSoto wasn't a submodel or a trim level under Chrysler. It was a completely independent brand within the Chrysler Corporation, operating from 1928 all the way to 1961 with its own dealer network and its own full lineup. And in 1956, DeSoto built one of the most overlooked high-performance cars of the entire decade. That car was the Adventurer, sometimes called the Golden Adventurer, because of all the gold trim running across the exterior. It came in just two colors, black or white, each one paired with a gold side sweep and gold hubcaps. This was a car that didn't need to announce itself out loud because the way it looked did all the talking. Under the hood was a Hemi Fiv 8 displacing 341 cubic inches, fed by dual 4-barrel Carter carburetors with a 9.25-to-1 compression ratio and a specially upgraded camshaft built specifically for this version. The factory rated it at 320 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute, a number DeSoto openly admitted was on the conservative side. It ran 0 to 60 in around 8.5 seconds, and its top speed was confirmed at 137 miles per hour during Daytona Speed Weeks and 144 miles per hour at the Chrysler Proving Grounds. On July 4, 1956, an Adventurer also competed at the Pikes Peak Hill Climb, which made it pretty clear that DeSoto didn't build this car just to look good in a showroom. Standard equipment included power steering, power brakes, a power seat, and power windows, all of it wrapped up in just 996 units produced that year. DeSoto was shut down entirely in 1961 when Chrysler started cutting brands during the economic downturn, and the name Adventurer faded into obscurity along with it. 1956 Packard Caribbean. There was a time when the name Packard meant something very specific in America. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, pulling up in a Packard told people everything they needed to know about who you were without saying a single word. But by the mid-1950s, the brand that had once been called the Rolls-Royce of America was losing ground fast against the Big Three, and the 1956 Caribbean was Packard's last real attempt to prove they still belonged in the fight. A 374 cubic inch V8 with dual 4-barrel Rochester carburetors and a 10-to-1 compression ratio made 310 horsepower, the highest output figure of any American production car that year, coming from a company that had only introduced its first V8 the year before. Cadillac had been running V8s since 1949, Chrysler since 1951, and Packard came to the party later than everyone else. But when their engine finally showed up, nobody in the room was making more power. Top speed cleared 125 miles per hour, and the quarter mile ran under 16 seconds. Push button. Twin Ultramatic automatic transmission was standard on the Caribbean. The seats were reversible, leather on one side and brocade fabric on the other, so the owner could flip them depending on the occasion. The sticker price was $5,995, roughly equivalent to around $70,000 today. Only 539 units were built, split between 276 convertibles and 263 hardtops. Packard had merged with Studebaker back in 1954, hoping the two companies could save each other. Instead, the partnership dragged both of them down at the same time. Packard was gone entirely by 1958, and with that, America lost one of the most storied names its automotive industry had ever produced. The 1956 Caribbean was the final bow of an empire that had once been untouchable, and a clean original example today will regularly clear $180,000 at auction. 1957 Rambler Rebel. American Motors Corporation was the smallest player in the American Big Four at the time, known almost entirely for building small, practical, fuel-efficient cars for people who didn't want to spend much money. In December of 1956, they showed up with something nobody in the industry expected from them, the Rambler Rebel. AMC took the 327 cubic inch V8, making 255 horsepower that normally lived in the full-size Nash Ambassador, and dropped it into the much lighter Rambler body, which tipped the scales at just 3,335 pounds. That power-to-weight ratio was the whole story. With a big engine stuffed into a small body, the Rebel didn't need to be a sports car to run like one. It was the exact same formula that Pontiac would use 7 years later to create the GTO and kick off the muscle car era. Motor Trend recorded a 0 to 60 time of exactly 7.5 seconds and a quarter mile of 18.32 seconds at the Daytona Speed Trials in 1957, the best result posted by any American production sedan that year, and only a step behind the two-seat Corvette. The price was just $2,786, the lowest of any high-performance car that year, and automotive historians widely regard the Rebel as the first factory-built, intermediate-sized performance car in history. AMC had originally planned to fit the Rebel with a Bendix electrojector fuel injection system good for 288 horsepower, but the system wasn't reliable enough, and not a single customer-delivered car ever received it. Only around 1,500 units were produced. After the strong showing at Daytona, AMC did essentially nothing with that momentum. They went back to economy cars and left that opportunity sitting on the table for years. 1957 Chrysler 300C. The Chrysler 300 letter series started in 1955 with the C300, a name that came directly from its 300 horsepower firepower. Every year after that, Chrysler added a new letter and pushed everything further. By 1957, they had arrived at the 300C, third in the series, and the one that many automotive historians consider the design peak of the entire letter series run, even though the 300D that followed the next year was actually more powerful. Sometimes the way something looks leaves a longer impression than any number on a spec sheet. The engine was a Hemi V8 displacing 392 cubic inches, fed by dual 4-barrel Carter carburetors running a 9.25-to-1 compression ratio. In standard trim, it produced 375 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute with 420 foot-pounds of torque at 4,000 revolutions per minute. Buyers who wanted more could option up to 390 horsepower, and that version ran 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds, covered the quarter mile in 15.9 seconds, and topped out at around 131 miles per hour. Those numbers came from a car that weighed over 4,000 pounds and stretched nearly 19 feet from bumper to bumper, the kind of car you'd look at and never in a million years expect to be that fast. Virgil Exner penned the styling under Chrysler's forward-look direction, with those sweeping fins rising off the rear and sharp body lines running the full length of the car. The 300C was also the first car in the letter series to offer a convertible body alongside the hardtop. Total production for 1957 came to 2,402 units, split between 1,918 hardtops and 484 convertibles, all of them equipped with TorqueFlite automatic, power steering, power brakes, and leather interior as standard. A writer covering the 300C in Automobile Quarterly put it plainly. When American society was criticizing tail fins as wasteful and excessive, they were talking about this exact car. The nickname Beautiful Brute has followed the 300C ever since, a car polished enough to take you to the opera and mean enough that nothing on the American road in 1957 wanted to challenge it. A solid original example changes hands today for anywhere between $80,000 and $120,000 at major auctions. 1957 Chevrolet Corvette Fully 283. The 1957 Corvette came equipped with Rochester ramjet fuel injection on a 283 cubic inch V8, marking the first time fuel injection had ever appeared on an American mass production car with no carburetor anywhere in sight. The result was 283 horsepower from exactly 283 cubic inches, 1 horsepower per cubic inch, a threshold that engineers of the era considered almost impossible to reach on a production vehicle. Chevrolet plastered the tagline, 1 horsepower per cubic inch, across every advertisement they ran nationally and branded the system the Fuelie, making it one of the boldest marketing moves of the decade. The man behind the achievement was Zora Arkus Duntov, a Belgian-born engineer of Russian descent who joined GM in 1953 and quickly became the person most responsible for shaping the Corvette's performance identity. He was the one who transformed the Corvette from a good-looking but slow car into something that made people nervous on a racetrack. Duntov developed the fuel injection system while wearing a full body cast, recovering from an accident at the GM Proving Grounds in 1956. He stood upright in that cast and worked on the design for months straight. And what he produced permanently changed the direction of everything Corvette would become. The Fuelie ran 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds with a top speed of 132 miles per hour. Numbers that many far more expensive European sports cars couldn't match in 1957. Total production that year was 6,339 units, every one of them a convertible, but only 1,040 carried the fuel injection system. Buyers who wanted to go even further could order the RPO 579E cold air package, though Chevrolet only built exactly 43 cars with that option. Also new in 1957 was a close-ratio 4-speed manual transmission, appearing on the Corvette option list for the first time starting in April, and when you paired that gearbox with the Fuelie, drivers at the time described it as the closest thing to a race car they had ever experienced on a public road. Fuel injection turned out to be too complicated for most mechanics of the era. Many owners eventually pulled the Fuelie themselves and replaced it with a conventional carburetor setup because nobody could fix it when it went wrong. The system didn't return to the Corvette until 1982, a full quarter-century later. Original Fuelie, 1957, Corvettes today are priced between $150,000 and $250,000, and the RPO 579E cars are rare enough that nobody knows exactly how many are still out there. 1959 Pontiac Bonneville 420-A. Before getting into this one, something needs to be said up front. The 1957 Corvette with its 5.7-second 0 to 60 is the faster car by the raw numbers, and it was a purpose-built 2-seat sports car designed to do one thing extremely well. The car at the top of today's list belongs to a completely different category. This is a full-size luxury sedan weighing over 4,000 pounds with room for 5 adults, air conditioning, leather seats, and in 1959, no full-size American car on public roads was quicker than the Pontiac Bonneville, equipped with the Tempest 420-A option. In the mid-1950s, Pontiac had an unofficial reputation within the industry as a car for conservative middle-aged buyers. Nothing wrong with it, nothing exciting about it either, and nobody was buying a Pontiac because they wanted to go fast. Semon Bunky Knudsen became general manager in 1956 and made it his mission to change that from the ground up. He brought engineer John DeLorean onto the team, pushed displacement numbers higher every year, put Pontiac into NASCAR racing, and by 1959, the brand's image had been rebuilt completely. The 389 cubic inch V8 sat at the heart of the entire Pontiac full-size lineup in 1959, offered across the board in several output levels, starting at 260 horsepower in base form and climbing to 315 horsepower with the tri-power setup, which used 3 two-barrel carburetors on a progressive linkage that kept only one carburetor open at light throttle and brought all 3 into play when the driver asked for everything the engine had. The Tempest 420-A was the top of the ladder, a 10.5 to 1 compression ratio, with a retuned tri-power setup producing 345 horsepower, a car weighing over 4,000 pounds running 0 to 60 in around 6.5 seconds. In 1959, no full-size American sedan could do that, and honestly, more than a few people who drove one for the first time weren't sure they could trust their own speedometer. Motor Trend named Pontiac its Car of the Year for 1959. That same year, Pontiac full-size cars won NASCAR races at both Daytona and Darlington. Total Bonneville production for the year came to 11,426 convertibles, 38,696 Vista hardtops, and 27,769 sport coupes. The 389 V8 is the same engine DeLorean later dropped directly into the 1964 GTO. When he stuffed it into the smaller Tempest body and called it the GTO, he was doing exactly what AMC had tried with the Rambler Rebel 7 years earlier, but this time he had the full resources of General Motors behind him, and this time America was ready for it. The 1959 Bonneville was the last step on the road that led to all of it. 1949 to 1952, Crosley Hotshot. In 1949, a radio manufacturer named Powell Crosley Jr. decided to do something that had nothing to do with radios at all. He also happened to own the Cincinnati Reds, so clearly this was a man who never ran short on ways to spend money. Working with engineer Paul Kloch, Crosley built the Hotshot, America's first post-war sports car, arriving 4 full years ahead of the Corvette. Don't picture anything grand. The engine was a 4-cylinder, 724 cubic centimeter unit, putting out just 26.5 horsepower, and the whole car weighed under 1,200 pounds. It was light enough that it barely needed a powerful engine to be quick, and at the very first Sebring race in 1950, a Hotshot owned by a Tampa dealer took the overall win under the Index of Performance formula, beating out competitors with far bigger engines. The car also had disc brakes on all 4 wheels, technology borrowed straight from aviation, decades ahead of nearly every other American automaker. Sounds impressive, but in practice those aircraft-style discs couldn't handle the road salt of a northern winter. They corroded and seized up. Crosley was forced to switch back to conventional Bendix drum brakes. In total, only 2,498 Hotshots and Supersports models were ever built across 4 years. The small car market collapsed in the early 1950s as Detroit rolled out bigger, more modern vehicles. Crosley Motors closed its doors for good in 1952. 4 years before the Corvette existed and 4 years after the Hotshot vanished, most car fans today have never even heard its name. 1951 to 1954, Nash Healey. The Nash Healey came out of a chance meeting aboard the Queen Elizabeth when British engineer Donald Healey, on the hunt for an engine supplier, ran into George Mason, president of Nash Kelvinator. Nash built the 6-cylinder Ambassador engine in Kenosha, Wisconsin, shipped it to England to be fitted into a chassis of Healey's own design, and then, starting in 1952, sent the bodies to Italy, where Pininfarina handled the restyling. 3 continents for a single car, and the shipping costs alone tell you where the price problem came from. In 1952, 2 race-prepared Nash Healeys entered the 24 Hours of Le Mans. One dropped out with engine trouble. The other finished first in class and 3rd overall, beating Aston Martin, Cunningham, and Ferrari, losing only to 2 factory-team Mercedes-Benz 300 SLs. That's the car we teased at the top of this video. The 1954 sticker price came in at nearly $6,000, almost double a Corvette at the time, largely because of that 3-continent shipping bill. American buyers weren't willing to pay extra just for a Le Mans badge, even a well-earned one. In May of 1954, Nash merged with Hudson to form American Motors, and the marketing budget for an expensive, low-volume sports car got cut almost immediately. Production stopped just a few months later, closing out the Nash Healey's entire run at just over 500 cars. 1952 to 1955, Cunningham C3. Briggs Cunningham never planned to sell cars to anybody. He was a wealthy speed enthusiast, and his one goal was putting a race car bearing his own name on the podium at Le Mans. The problem was a rule from the organizers. To compete, a manufacturer had to build at least 25 street-legal cars to qualify as a real automaker. Cunningham had zero interest in becoming a manufacturer, but he didn't have a choice. The C3 came out of that requirement, powered by a Chrysler Firepower Hemi displacing 331 cubic inches, tuned up to 220 horsepower from a stock 180. The body was built by the Vignale shop in Italy off a design from Giovanni Michelotti, and it looked close enough to a Ferrari 212 that people mixed them up at a glance. Starting price landed near $9,000, with some versions reaching $15,000, roughly 3 times the cost of a Cadillac Coupe de Ville at the time. At that price, the C3 basically had no customer base outside the ultra-wealthy. Total production over its entire run came to just 27 cars, and Cunningham lost money on every single one because profit was never really the point. His race team ran at Le Mans multiple times, finishing third overall in both 1953 and 1954, exactly what those 27 C3s had been built to fund. By the end of 1955, the B.S. Cunningham Company shut down. Briggs Cunningham moved on to racing factory Jaguars in America. The C3 is still chased hard by collectors today, precisely because that number, 27, means finding one anywhere is next to impossible. 1954 Kaiser Darren. In November of 1952, 2 months before GM unveiled the Corvette, a fiberglass-bodied sports car prototype showed up at the Motorama show in Los Angeles. That was the Kaiser Darren, funded out of designer Howard Dutch Darren's own pocket before he talked Henry Kaiser into actually putting it into production. The automotive press at the time flat out called it the sports car America had been waiting for, even though nobody had driven one on a real road yet. The detail people remember most is the doors. Instead of swinging open, they slid straight into the front fender wells, a solution nobody had tried before and nobody copied afterward. The narrow opening made getting in and out awkward. Early production cars tended to jam, and dirt working its way into the door tracks didn't help. Kaiser eventually switched to nylon roller bushings to patch the problem. The 6-cylinder Willys Hurricane engine at 161 cubic inches produced anywhere from 90 to 125 horsepower depending on trim, enough for a 95-mile-per-hour top speed, but nowhere near enough to compete head-to-head with imported European sports cars. At $3,670, it cost more than a Cadillac Series 62, right as Kaiser's dealer network was falling apart, with many franchises switching brands or closing entirely. Kaiser only managed to build 435 Darrens, all within a single stretch from January to August of 1954. A freak snowstorm destroyed roughly 50 more cars waiting for delivery. Dutch Darren later bought up the wrecked cars and leftover parts, hand-fitted Cadillac Viv 8 engines into a handful of the final examples, and sold them straight out of his own showroom in Hollywood. 1962 to 1963, Studebaker Avanti. In 1961, Studebaker was staring at bankruptcy. President Sherwood Egbert brought in Raymond Loewy, a designer who'd worked with the company since the 1930s, and gave him exactly 40 days to sketch out a car that could save it. Loewy worked with a team of Bob Andrews, Tom Kellogg, and John Epstein out of a rented house in Palm Springs, and the result was the Avanti, unveiled to the public on April 26, 1962. Fiberglass body, air intakes mounted under the front bumper instead of a traditional grille, and the first American mass-produced car with factory-standard front disc brakes. Later that year, Andy Granatelli took a supercharged Avanti R3 out to the Bonneville Salt Flats and broke 29 national speed records in a single run, topping 170 miles per hour, making it the fastest mass-produced car certified by the United States Auto Club at that time. Egbert set a target of 20,000 cars sold in the first year. Studebaker only managed to deliver 1,200. The culprit was the fiberglass curing process itself, which caused uneven warping and forced every single body to be hand-corrected before it left the plant. Orders backed up for months, and plenty of customers who'd put down deposits gave up waiting and bought a Corvette or an import instead. In December of 1963, the South Bend plant closed for good. Total Studebaker-era Avanti production landed at 4,643 cars, counting both the 1963 and 1964 model years. 1964 to 1966. Griffith Series 200. Jack Griffith ran an auto shop on Long Island that catered to racers like Mark Donohue. At a dinner with Carroll Shelby, he claimed he could build a car faster than the AC Cobra. His first attempt, cramming a Ford V8 into an off-the-shelf TVR Gran Turismo, flopped completely. So Griffith convinced TVR to ship him bare chassis instead. No engine, no transmission, letting him finish the job himself back in the States. Griffith's crew had to trim the frame and literally hammer parts of the body into shape just to make room for a Ford 289 V8, an engine that little British car was never designed to hold. The result weighed only about 1,900 pounds, and the top-spec K-code version delivered 271 horsepower, hitting 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3.9 seconds, and a top speed of 163 miles per hour. Starting price was just $3,995, while a Cobra 289 from the same era could run past $6,000. The engine bay was so tight the car ran hot constantly, forcing mechanics to cut extra vents into the front fenders using strips of aluminum kitchen trim, which is exactly why people in the shop started calling them refrigerator cars. That cooling problem stuck with Griffith for the entire production run and was never fully solved. Only 192 Griffith Series 200 cars were ever built before the company moved on to the successor, the Griffith 400. A dock workers' strike disrupted the supply of bodies coming in from England and Italy, draining Griffith's cash reserves. The follow-up Griffith 600, with a steel body built by Intermeccanica in Italy, only got as far as a handful of cars, fewer than a dozen, before Jack Griffith's company shut down for good. 1974 to 1976. Bricklin SV1. Malcolm Bricklin had brought Subaru into the American market back in 1968, and after the Subaru 360 got torn apart over safety concerns, he pivoted hard, deciding to build a sports car with safety front and center. The SV1, short for Safety Vehicle 1, had an integrated roll cage, bumpers designed to absorb low-speed impacts, and a body made from color, impregnated acrylic bonded to fiberglass, so it never needed paint and could shrug off minor scratches. The gull-wing doors ran on hydraulics, weighed nearly 90 pounds each, and took a full 12 seconds to open all the way. Bricklin marketed them as safer than conventional doors since they couldn't swing out into traffic. The 1974 model used an AMC 360 V8, rated at 220 horsepower. By 1975, AMC engine supply had dried up, forcing Bricklin to switch to a Ford 351 Windsor, putting out only 175 horsepower, which meant redesigning the entire subframe just to make it fit. The factory sat in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, funded by a provincial government loan. The acrylic layer kept delaminating from the fiberglass underneath during the molding process, with failure rates hitting 60% at one point. Inexperienced workers, family members of Bricklin holding key management roles, and a price that more than doubled in 2 years, jumping from an initially projected $4,000 to nearly $10,000 in reality, all piled on top of each other. By late 1975, the New Brunswick government pulled its funding and the company landed in receivership almost immediately. Roughly 2,900 SV1s were built across the entire production run, nearly a decade before DeLorean released the gull-wing car most people assume was the first one. 1989 to 1993 Vector W8. Jerry Wiegert sketched out the idea for an American supercar back in 1971, but it took him almost 2 decades to actually raise the money, to build it. The W2 prototype made the rounds at auto shows through the 1970s and 80s, and by the late 80s, Vector Aeromotive had grown from a single building with 4 employees to 4 buildings with 80, enough to finally put the W8 into production. The twin-turbo 6.0-liter V8, built on a heavily reworked small-block Chevrolet foundation, was rated at 625 horsepower and 649 pound-feet of torque. Vector claimed a 0 to 60 mile-per-hour time of just 3.9 seconds and a top speed of 242 miles per hour. The chassis used an aluminum honeycomb structure. The body combined carbon fiber and Kevlar, and more than 5,000 aircraft-grade rivets went into assembly. The sticker price ran past $445,000, roughly the cost of a house in plenty of states at the time. Early in 1991, Car and Driver brought 2 W8s in for testing back-to-back. The first blew its transmission that same morning. Vector's crew worked through the night to fix it, and the next day, the second car overheated mid-test. On the upside, Road and Track named the W8 the fastest production car they tested in 1992. In August of 1991, tennis star Andre Agassi returned his W8 after the rear carpet caught fire from an overheating exhaust system, a story that made headlines across the country. Only 17 customer cars and 2 pre-production examples ever left the factory, 19 genuine W8s in total. In 1993, majority shareholder Megatech carried out a hostile takeover, pushing Wiegert out of the company he'd founded. He sued and won, reclaiming the design rights and the unsold inventory. 1951 Chrysler New Yorker. On February 9, 1951, Chrysler dealerships across the country opened their doors with a completely new lineup. Customers walked in, looked under the hood, and most of them had no idea what they were looking at. What Chrysler called the Firepower V8 looked like nothing so much as an enormous iron block weighing close to 1,000 pounds, bigger than any mass-production V8 on the market at the time, and expensive enough to manufacture that Chrysler's accounting department never quite stopped shaking their heads throughout the entire development process. The number on paper was 180 horsepower. That might not sound like much until you realize that the best Cadillac that year was making 160. Chrysler had just beaten Cadillac by more than 20 horsepower right out of the gate. Chief engineer James Zeter went so far as to publish a piece in Motor Trend's December 1951 issue declaring that Chrysler was repositioning itself as a powerhouse of engineering and speed. And he wrote that after the engine had already been proven on the road, not as a marketing promise. It was K.T. Keller himself, Chrysler's CEO, and a man who kept a machine shop in his own basement, who signed off on the whole project while the accounting team was still wringing their hands over production costs. By the end of 1951, automotive journalist Tom McCahill drove a stock New Yorker at Daytona Beach and took the trophy for the fastest American production car. A commercial sedan bought straight off the showroom floor, faster than anything else Detroit had put out that year. And here is the part worth noting. The firepower was only available in the New Yorker and the Saratoga. The Windsor kept its 6-cylinder. Chrysler knew exactly what they were selling, and they had no intention of making it common too soon. 1955 Chrysler C300. In 1955, Chrysler did something Detroit had never thought to do before. They took a full race engine, dropped it into a luxury car, and put it on sale for $4,100. The name they gave it was equally straightforward, C300, a number that reflected exactly how much horsepower the car produced, no more, no less. No American manufacturer had touched 300 horsepower in a production car before that year, and Chrysler got there by equipping the C300 with dual Carter 4-barrel carburetors, a high-performance solid lifter camshaft, and a high-flow dual exhaust. The whole setup looked like a racing kit bolted straight onto an assembly line. The car weighed over 4,500 pounds and still ran 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 10 seconds, the first American production car to do it. At Daytona Beach in 1955, A C300 ran the flying mile at 127.58 miles per hour, beating the previous record by 7 miles per hour. Then, on the NASCAR circuit, Carl Kiekhaefer's team put the C300 on the track and won 27 of the 45 Grand National races that year. Ford, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, all of them went home empty-handed. Chrysler barely had to modify the car from its showroom configuration. The press called it the banker's hot rod. Men in suits drove it to the office in the morning and put their foot down on the highway on the way home. Only 1,725 were built that year, and Chrysler couldn't fit air conditioning because the engine bay simply didn't allow for it. If you wanted a C300, you sweated through the summer. With the C300, Chrysler laid the foundation for everything that would eventually be called the muscle car, a concept Detroit wouldn't officially name for another 10 years. 1956 DeSoto Adventurer. DeSoto launched the Adventurer in 1956 with a decision that must have caused some lengthy arguments in the marketing department. 2 colors only, white with gold or black with gold, and buyers had no other option. The wheel covers were gold, and the side trim ran the same color from front to rear. DeSoto clearly had no interest in anyone confusing this car with an ordinary fire dome sitting next to it on the lot. Under the hood sat a 341 cubic inch fire dome Hemi V8 with dual Carter 4-barrel carburetors, a 9.25-to-1 compression ratio, and 320 horsepower at 5,200 RPM. That was a serious number for a 1956 car, especially at a base price of $3,680, considerably less than a Chrysler C300, but not far behind in performance. DeSoto referred to it as the Golden Adventurer in some internal documents, and honestly, that name fit better than the official one. Only 996 were built in the first year, partly because DeSoto deliberately kept production limited to maintain the car's exclusivity. One Adventurer was driven straight to Daytona Speed Week that same year and raced essentially as delivered from the showroom. For 1957, DeSoto pushed things further with a 345 cubic inch engine making 345 horsepower, exactly 1 horsepower per cubic inch, and that was standard equipment for anyone who walked into a dealership. The Chrysler 300B had hit the same ratio the year before, but only with an expensive optional high-compression tune. The Adventurer did it as the base configuration, no questions asked. Production climbed to 1,950 units for 1957, including 300 convertibles, the first open-top Adventurer ever offered. Then, in 1958, the Hemi was gone. DeSoto switched to a cheaper wedge-head engine, and the Adventurer was never that quick again. 1956 Dodge D500. While the Chrysler C300 and DeSoto Adventurer were selling Hemi power at luxury car prices, Dodge took a different approach entirely. In 1956, they rolled out the D500 package, and what set it apart from everything that came before was simple. Any customer buying any Dodge model could order it. From the entry-level Coronet all the way up to the Custom Royal, Dodge put the same Hemi under every hood without distinction. The engine was a 315 cubic inch Super Red Ram Hemi V8 with a single 4-barrel carburetor producing 260 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 330 foot-pounds of torque. Dodge also dropped the entire D500 package 1.5 inches lower than the standard Dodge ride height, installed heavy-duty suspension components sourced from the New Yorker and Imperial lines, and upgraded the brakes throughout. The result looked meaner and sat lower than anything the brand had sold before. For buyers who wanted even more, there was the D501 variant, which added a second 4-barrel carburetor and a more aggressive camshaft, pushing output to around 295 horsepower. That version was essentially built with NASCAR in mind, and Dodge made no effort to hide it. 1957 was the last year for the Dodge Hemi. Dodge bored the engine out to 325 cubic inches and took the D500 to 285 horsepower with a single carb or 310 with the dual setup. The D501, the most extreme version, ran the 354 cubic inch Chrysler 300B block with 340 horsepower, and only 101 of those were ever produced. By 1958, Dodge had moved to a wedge head engine and never looked back. The small D500 badge on the trunk lid disappeared right along with it. 1957, Chrysler 300C. If there was one year when Chrysler proved they weren't just keeping pace with the competition but pulling away from it, 1957 was that year. The 300C arrived with an entirely new engine, 392 cubic inches, a raised deck version of the firepower Hemi that gave Chrysler engineers the extra block height they needed for a longer piston stroke. Standard output was 375 horsepower. At that moment, no American production car had reached that number. Twin Carter 4-barrel carburetors sat on top, compression ratio was 9.25 to 1, and the entire package was tuned to produce torque across a broader RPM range than previous versions. Top speed was estimated at around 145 miles per hour. Chrysler also added dedicated brake cooling ducts for the front wheels for the first time, a detail lifted straight from racing practice. But the standard version wasn't even the most interesting part. Chrysler also offered a 390 horsepower option with an extremely aggressive race camshaft and significantly higher compression. The catch was that buyers had to take a 3-speed manual transmission with it. Chrysler didn't trust any automatic to handle that camshaft under daily driving conditions. Some experts have since estimated that the actual output of those cars may have exceeded 400 horsepower. Only 18 were confirmed built. On the outside, the 300C wore Virgil Exner's forward look styling with a wide trapezoidal grille, a curved Vista Dome windshield, and fins that swept up from the rear doors. 1957 was also the first year a convertible was offered, and Chrysler sold 484 of them out of 2,402 total units for the year. Hardtops started at $4,929, and the convertible came in at $5,359. Not cheap, but far less expensive than what the car was actually capable of doing. The 300D followed in 1958 with the same 392 engine tuned to 380 horsepower, and an optional Bendix fuel injection system that proved so troublesome most units were recalled and replaced with carburetors. That was also the last year the first-generation Hemi appeared in the 300 series. 1957 Chrysler Imperial. Throughout most of the 1950s, Cadillac had an almost complete grip on the top of the American luxury market. Lincoln made a reasonable case for itself. Imperial was largely ignored. 1957 was the year that changed. The 1957 Imperial didn't share its platform with any other Chrysler product, the first time that had ever been true for the nameplate. Chrysler built it on its own dedicated assembly line at the Jefferson Avenue plant in Detroit, running at a slower pace specifically to allow for tighter quality control. The result was a car that no longer felt like a slightly upmarket New Yorker, either mechanically or visually. Under the hood was the 392 cubic inch Hemi, rated at 325 horsepower in the standard trim and 350 horsepower in the Crown. Up front, the new torsion air suspension replaced coil springs with torsion bars, paired with the newly introduced TorqueFlite 3-speed automatic. A car weighing nearly 5,000 pounds still managed 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 9.8 seconds and a top speed of 125 miles per hour, numbers that Cadillac couldn't match that year. Virgil Exner redesigned the exterior with curved side glass, the first time that feature had appeared on any production automobile. The wraparound windshield was 48% larger than the 1956 unit. Cadillac took one look at the Imperial's front-end design and essentially copied it for the 1959 Cadillac. though nobody in the industry said so publicly at the time. Sales for 1957 reached 37,593 units, up from 10,684 the year before, a jump of more than 250% in a single model year. At the top of the lineup, the Crown Imperial Ghia limousine was hand-built in Italy for $12,000 a copy, with only 36 produced over 3 years. Not a car you bought to drive hard, but if you needed to, it absolutely could. 1952 to 1955, Cunningham C3. Briggs Cunningham is a name that most Americans have never heard, but at Le Mans in the early 1950s, it was a name that made Ferrari and Jaguar pay attention. He was born into one of the wealthiest families in the country, had everything a man could want, and the one thing he wanted most was to put an American car on the podium at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. To do that, he needed an engine worth the effort, and Chrysler was the only manufacturer willing to sell him one at a 40% discount. Cadillac had already said no. To qualify as a manufacturer for Le Mans, Cunningham needed to produce at least 25 road-going cars. He set up a factory in West Palm Beach, Florida, shipped rolling chassis to Turin, Italy, where Vignale finished the bodies to a design by Giovanni Michelotti, the same designer who had worked on numerous Ferraris at that same coach building shop. The result was the C3, a grand tourer with an aluminum body on a steel ladder frame powered by a 331 cubic inch firepower Hemi that Cunningham had reworked with 4 single-barrel Zenith carburetors, pushing output from 180 to 220 horsepower. Top speed was around 135 miles per hour, and the car could run 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 7 seconds with the semi-automatic transmission. Prices ranged from $9,000 to $15,000 depending on the configuration, 3 to 4 times the cost of a Corvette at the time. Cunningham lost money on every single car he sold, knew it going in, and kept building them because Le Mans mattered more than any balance sheet. All 25 were completed, exactly the minimum required, comprising 5 cabriolets and 20 coupes. The Cunningham team finished 3rd overall at Le Mans in 1953 and repeated that result in 1954. The C3 was later selected by the Museum of Modern Art in New York as one of the 10 best contemporary automobiles, an honor that Briggs Cunningham almost certainly ranked well below his Le Mans results. Today, surviving C3s in good condition regularly fetch around $1 million at auction. 1954, Volkswagen FV. In 1954, a French industrialist named Jean Daninos ran into a problem that no French automaker could solve for him. He wanted to build a proper luxury grand tourer, and there wasn't a single manufacturer in France producing a V8 powerful enough for the job. His solution was to fly to Detroit and buy an engine from Chrysler. The Volkswagen FV debuted at the Paris Salon in October 1954, powered by a DeSoto Firedome 4.5-liter Hemi V8, making 180 horsepower, mated to either Chrysler's Powerflight automatic or a 4-speed Pont-à-Mousson manual at extra cost. Daninos designed the exterior himself, keeping the tail fins modest and using stainless steel trim instead of conventional chrome plating, while the dashboard inside drew obvious inspiration from aircraft cockpit design. Top speed ranged from 107 to 120 miles per hour, depending on which rear axle ratio the customer chose. The starting price was $7,000, considerably more than most American cars of the era, and France's horsepower-based tax system penalized powerful cars so heavily that 77% of total production was exported. The Volkswagen customer list reads like a Hollywood party crossed with the European art world. Ava Gardner, Frank Sinatra, Pablo Picasso, Christian Dior, Sterling Moss, and King Hassan II of Morocco all owned one at some point. For 1955, Daninos upgraded to a 4.8-liter engine, making 200 horsepower in the FV1. Later that same year, the FV2 arrived with the 5.4-liter Chrysler 331 cubic inch unit and 250 horsepower. The FVS replaced that in 1956 with the same basic engine, but a range of mechanical improvements. Every year brought another upgrade, and Chrysler supplied the engine every single time. There is one detail that tends to get overlooked. Chrysler itself was buying that same Pont-à-Mousson 4-speed manual from France, the identical unit that Faisal Vega was using, to fit into the race specification Chrysler 300 letter series cars. Two manufacturers on opposite sides of the Atlantic were sharing components with each other, and the automotive press of the day barely mentioned it. Faisal Vega shut its doors in 1964 after the Facelia model, fitted with an in-house developed engine, failed catastrophically on reliability. Roughly 350 FV series cars were built across the entire production run. The 1950 Ford Crestliner. Right after World War II, American automakers rushed to build something different to lure buyers back into the showroom. Ford was no exception. So they introduced the Crestliner, a sedan whose big selling point was a black vinyl roof. That's right, a car marketed heavily because it had fake leather glued to the top. At the time, the vinyl roof idea might have seemed bold, giving the car a sporty upscale look. But beyond that cosmetic touch, the Crestliner had nothing new to offer. The same old flathead V8 engine, standard steering and suspension, no breakthrough technology anywhere. Buyers expected a different driving experience, and they were let down. The vinyl roof was controversial too. Some people thought it looked cool, plenty of others thought it looked cheap and fake. The bigger problem was that outside of that roof, the Crestliner had nothing to compete with Chevrolet or Plymouth at the time. Ford only built the Crestliner for a short run. Despite its classic, charming look, this model was quickly forgotten, because it represented a mindset of chasing a surface-level gimmick while forgetting the core value underneath. The 1951 Mercury Monterey. At first glance, the Mercury Monterey looked like the American dream. A long body, sweeping lines, gleaming chrome, all radiating elegance and class. Ford positioned it for buyers who wanted something more upscale than a regular sedan, but weren't ready to step up to a Lincoln, and style-wise, the Monterey delivered. It looked like a coupe a movie star of the era might drive, stylish and modern. But then you got behind the wheel. The trouble started the moment you hit the gas. Under the hood sat a flathead V8, strong enough for city driving, but nowhere near enough to deliver any real thrill. The steering was heavy, the body was big and bulky, and driving the Monterey felt like steering a sofa on wheels. The interior was roomy and upscale, but not all that different from cheaper cars of the same era. And with a higher price tag than its rivals, without standout technology or superior performance to justify it, the Monterey quickly faded into the background. Today, the Monterey is remembered as a fashion car, a good-looking machine that never had the substance to become a lasting icon. When style is all you have and depth is missing, a car gets left behind fast. The 1959 Chevrolet El Camino. Blending the practicality of a pickup with the comfort of a coupe sounds appealing, at least on paper. That's exactly what the 1959 Chevrolet El Camino was chasing, a two-in-one vehicle, part fun, part hauler. In reality, though, the El Camino ended up lost between two worlds. Built on the Chevrolet Impala platform, the El Camino inherited the flashy design language of the 50s, big tail fins, a low stance, sweeping curves. But that same look made it feel more like a showpiece than a work truck. Weak payload capacity, a low ground clearance, a small bed, and low towing capability meant it couldn't compete with real pickup trucks. On the passenger car side, the El Camino didn't offer the comfort or convenience of a sedan from the same era either. Interior space was sacrificed for the bed design, leaving drivers with a car that felt like neither one thing nor the other. Not quite a car, not quite a truck. Around the same time, Ford launched the Ranchero, a similar concept but more practical and better balanced, which overshadowed the El Camino right out of the gate. Bold idea, sure. But the 1959 version proved a simple point. When you try to do two things at once, sometimes you end up doing neither one well. The 1957 Lincoln Premier. If you wanted to turn every head on the street in 1957, the Lincoln Premier was your car. With a flashy exterior, chrome piled on thick, and a massive stature, it wasn't shy about announcing itself as the pinnacle of American luxury. The problem? It was almost too much to handle. The Premier stretched nearly 19 feet long and weighed more than 2.2 tons. That made maneuvering through the city a nightmare. A heavy front end, a raised rear, and limited visibility made driving it feel like piloting a ship. Despite a powerful V8 under the hood, the car still responded sluggishly and drank fuel at an alarming rate, even by 1950s standards. Inside, it was genuinely luxurious, thick cushioned seats, premium materials, plenty of electric conveniences. But behind all that glamour sat a design lacking real innovation. While rivals like Cadillac were starting to roll out advanced technology, Lincoln was standing still. With a high price, oversized proportions, and performance that didn't match the hype, the Premier couldn't hold on to customers for long. Today it's remembered as a symbol of an era when American automakers substituted bigness and glitz for refinement and efficiency. The 1958 Buick Limited. Buick used to stand for accessible luxury. But the 1958 Limited played like an off-key symphony. At over 18 feet long and weighing nearly 2.3 tons, this car was essentially a yacht on the street, heavy and hard to maneuver in the tight urban spaces of the time. Under the hood sat a 364 cubic inch V8, powerful sounding on paper, but fuel economy was laughably poor, hovering around 7 to 8 miles per gallon. And the interior was genuinely upscale, leather seats, full power accessories, but add it all up and you got a car almost nobody wanted to drive every day. The issue wasn't just size, it was the whole design philosophy. More chrome, longer is better. The result was an oversized, overpriced car that ultimately flopped in the market. Buick sold only around 7,400 units, and the Limited was discontinued the very next year. A textbook example of what happens when design overtakes function. The 1955 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz. At the peak of American extravagance, Cadillac defined wealth and style, and the Eldorado Biarritz sat right at the top of that definition. At a launch price of over $6,200, roughly $70,000 today, this was a car built for people who wanted to prove their status more than enjoy the drive. At first glance, the Eldorado Biarritz was a work of art. Tall, soaring tail fins, gleaming chrome trim, a sleek two-door convertible top. But look closer and the cracks appear. The heavy weight of the car hurt acceleration, even with a 331 cubic inch V8 producing 270 horsepower. Driving through tight city streets was tiring too, thanks to the wide body and low center of gravity. What's more telling is this: you paid for the design, but you didn't get any real breakthrough in return. No pioneering technology, no exceptional performance, just looks. And those looks came with a steep maintenance bill too. From the leather interior to the gold-plated trim, everything was expensive and hard to replace. The Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz was, without question, a symbol of prestige. But it was also proof that you can pay for the flash without getting a fully rounded car in return. A masterpiece to look at, but a luxury game not built for the average buyer. The 1957 Ford Skyliner Retractable. Picture a car that could transform itself from a hardtop coupe into a convertible with the push of a button. It sounds like a miracle for 1950, doesn't it? Well, Ford actually pulled it off with the Skyliner Retractable, the first mass-produced car with a fully retractable, hardtop roof. But behind the spectacle was a genuinely messy reality. The Skyliner's folding roof mechanism was a mechanical marvel. 7 electric motors, 6 locking mechanisms, 4 lifting units, and nearly 600 feet of wiring. When it worked smoothly, it was a stunning show. But the moment a single motor failed, everything ground to a halt. On top of that, The storage space needed for the folded roof ate up almost the entire trunk, leaving barely any room for luggage on a road trip. Combined with the extra weight from all that complex machinery, the car became heavier, thirstier, and harder to handle than other Fords of the era. And at a price of nearly $3,000 at the time, more than $33,000 today. The Skyliner left plenty of people asking themselves, was that folding roof show really worth all the hassle? The Ford Skyliner retractable stands as a perfect example of impressive engineering not translating into commercial success. Today it's celebrated as a mechanical masterpiece worth collecting, but back then it served as a warning. When engineers overthink things, drivers end up with a headache. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham. If you lived in America in 1959, the money it took to buy a house could also buy you a Cadillac Eldorado Brougham. A starting price of over $3,000 at the time, equivalent to roughly $135,000 today, made it one of the most expensive cars ever built in America. So what justified that price tag? The answer was pure extravagance: leather, wool, and brushed stainless steel inside, a gleaming stainless steel roof, and an absurd list of luxury touches: a built-in perfume bottle, stainless steel cocktail cups, and even memory seats. Every single Brougham was hand-assembled, giving owners the feeling of driving an American-made Rolls-Royce. But underneath all that opulence lay a mountain of technical headaches. The advanced air suspension broke down constantly, the cutting-edge electronics were a nightmare to repair, and the sheer weight of the body left even a powerful V8 gasping for breath. Driving it through the city became an awkward experience, big and clumsy to maneuver. Cadillac built exactly 99 units of the Eldorado Brougham that year. Rare and unusual as it was, this model never became a popular choice because it represented a flawed philosophy that excessive luxury isn't always what customers actually need. The 1956 DeSoto Adventurer. Right from the name Adventurer, DeSoto wanted to project the image of a car built for thrill seekers, for speed, for something bold. And credit where it's due, the exterior design really did turn heads: daring curves, sparkling chrome, and a striking two-tone paint job. Unfortunately, only the looks were fast. Everything else fell short. The Adventurer was marketed as a high-performance model, a rival to the Corvette and the Thunderbird. On paper, a powerful Hemi V8 producing over 300 horsepower sounded very promising. But once you got behind the wheel, the weaknesses showed up fast. Soft suspension, weak brakes, and a heavy body meant the driving experience felt vague and anything but sporty. Buyers expected a fast coupe and instead got a car that looked quick but drove like a family sedan. That was the core problem. The advertising and the reality didn't match. And in the 1950s, right as the performance car boom was taking off, that mismatch pushed the Adventurer straight out of the race. Today, the Adventurer stands as a perfect lesson. If you're going to promise speed, make sure the steering wheel can back it up. The 1958 Lincoln Continental Mark III. Some cars make you feel like royalty the moment you step in. The Mark III made you feel like you were piloting a battleship instead. Nearly 20 feet long and weighing more than 2.3 tons, the Lincoln Continental Mark III became a symbol of excess in both design and purpose. Lincoln wanted to build a flagship luxury model to go head-to-head with Cadillac. They packed it full of modern features for the time: 6-way power seats, an automatic trunk lid, power windows, all sounding impressive on paper. But there was one big problem. Everything was heavy and prone to breaking down. The boxy design, the short and unbalanced tail fins, and a front end as stiff as an armored vehicle all made the Mark III look disjointed and far from graceful. And on the road, a 430 cubic inch V8, powerful as it was, couldn't make up for the car's sluggishness or its brutal fuel consumption. At a price of nearly $6,000 at the time, more than $65,000 today, the Mark III landed right in fierce competition with the Cadillac Eldorado, without quite having the substance to win. Today, the Mark III is remembered not for success, but for representing an era when automakers believed bigger meant more luxurious, meant better. And they were wrong. The 1958 Edsel Pacer. Ford genuinely believed Edsel would become the new ace in its lineup, filling the gap between Ford and Mercury. Instead of a breakthrough, the Edsel Pacer turned into one of the most painful failures in American automotive history. Why did it go so wrong? From the name itself to the marketing campaign, Ford loaded Edsel with enormous expectations. But when the Pacer finally arrived, consumers were stunned, and not in a good way. The front-end design, with its odd horse-collar grille, struck many people as clunky and confusing, and worse, the promises made in the advertising didn't line up with the real-world experience. With a starting price around $2,900, more than $30,000 today, the Pacer was positioned as a mid-tier luxury car. But poor build quality, a teletouch transmission that failed constantly, and a string of electrical problems eroded buyer trust fast. In an economy that was already slowing down, spending money on an unreliable car was something Americans simply weren't willing to accept. Sales collapsed, dealers stopped ordering it, and within just a few years, the Edsel name faded into obscurity. Today, the Edsel Pacer stands as a clear lesson. Marketing can't save a product that isn't good enough. A beautiful dream shattered by overconfidence and a failure to understand the customer. The 1959 Ford Edsel Ranger. You can't talk about disappointing cars without mentioning Edsel, and within that story, the Ranger is the clearest example of all. Born out of Ford's ambition to launch a brand new mid-tier brand, the Edsel Ranger was expected to make a real mark. Instead, it became one of the longest, steepest slides in American automotive history. Design-wise, the front end with its famous horse-collar grille sparked fierce debate. Few people loved it, many were turned off. But the problem wasn't just looks. The Ranger also came loaded with so-called modern features, push-button gear selection, a domed electronic speedometer, all sounding great on paper but proving difficult to use, prone to failure, and expensive to repair. The V8 engine was adequate, but the driving experience wasn't particularly exciting. On top of that, poor build quality, misaligned doors, flimsy interior trim chipped away at buyer confidence, and as the market entered a period of tightened spending, the Ranger never got a chance to course correct. Today, the Edsel Ranger stands as a symbol of failing to understand the market. It reminds us that no matter how fresh your idea is, if it doesn't solve a real need, it's nothing more than a failed experiment. 1953 Kaiser Dragon. In 1953, Kaiser Frazer was a small independent automaker just trying to survive against the big three, without a V8 engine or anything close to the advertising budget Cadillac and Lincoln had. So Kaiser's team decided to try something nobody else had tried: turn their top sedan into a piece of jewelry. The Kaiser Dragon became America's first mass-production car with genuine 14-karat gold trim on the hood emblem, the fender nameplates, and even the dashboard badge. The interior was upholstered in bamboo vinyl, patterned to look like dragon skin, paired with imported Belgian Laguna cloth. The owner's name was even engraved on a small plate mounted inside the glove box, a little reminder that this wasn't a car built for everybody. The car carried a price tag of $3,924, while a Cadillac Series 62 sedan with an 8-cylinder V8 cost about $3,666. The Dragon, meanwhile, only ran a 6-cylinder engine putting out 118 horsepower. Think about that for a second. You were paying more money for less power just to get real gold trim and a strange patterned vinyl. Kaiser only managed to sell 1,277 units during the 6 months of production in 1953, the only year the Dragon ever existed. And then the name disappeared from American automotive history entirely. Here's the interesting part, though. The Dragons that survived are hunted down aggressively by collectors today. One has sold at auction for nearly $30,000, a huge jump from what it cost brand new. 1954 to 1955, Hudson Italia. In the early 1950s, Hudson was in serious financial trouble. Management looked over at Chrysler, saw how much buzz they were getting from those Ghia-bodied show cars, and figured they'd try the same trick. So Hudson partnered with Carrozzeria Touring, an Italian coach builder known for its superleggera technique, a lightweight tube frame wrapped in hand-formed aluminum panels. What came out of that partnership looked nothing like any other Hudson. The body was entirely hand-formed aluminum with a full wraparound windshield straight out of the Corvette playbook. But the detail people remember most is the doors, cut deep into the roofline in what got called an aircraft door design, meant to make getting in and out easier. Inside, the seats were hand-stitched leather with 3 different foam densities for support, sitting on thick Italian carpeting. The price landed around $4,800, more than a Cadillac Coupe de Ville. Meanwhile, the engine under that hood was just Hudson's ordinary 6-cylinder, nothing special at all. Customers were paying for an Italian body, but getting the power of an everyday car. Frankly, that's a tough sell, no matter how you package it. On the very day the Italia was announced for production, Hudson revealed its merger with Nash to form American Motors. The new management had zero reason to keep funding a halo car for a brand that was about to disappear. Only 26 Hudson Italias were ever hand-built in Italy before the whole project got shut down. 1951 to 1954, Muntz Jet. Earl Muntz first made his money selling cut-rate TVs and radios in Southern California, with ads so over the top that people started calling him Madman Muntz. He's also credited with popularizing the abbreviation TV that we still use today. But the thing that made Muntz legendary among car collectors was a 4-seat convertible carrying his own name, the Muntz Jet. Muntz bought the design outright from Frank Curtis, an engineer who'd built Indy race cars, then stretched the frame to fit a back seat. Under the hood sat a Cadillac or Lincoln V8, putting out around 160 horsepower. But what turned the Jet into a Hollywood living room legend was what was stuffed inside it: a built-in liquor cabinet right at the front seat, and even a mini fridge to keep drinks cold on long drives. Prices ran somewhere between $5,000 and $5,500, more than a comparable Lincoln or Cadillac at the time. Muntz openly admitted he lost about $1,000 on every car he sold because the hand-built production costs were simply higher than what customers were willing to pay. Honestly, this was one of the most reckless bets any outsider ever made in Detroit. Grace Kelly, Mickey Rooney, and actress Clara Bow all owned a Jet at one point. But a celebrity client list wasn't enough to save the company. By 1954, the Muntz Car Company had collapsed, taking down his electronics business right along with it. The most reliable sources today agree that only around 200 Jets were ever built, despite Muntz himself claiming a much higher number over the years. 1953 to 1956, Packard Caribbean. In the early 1950s, Packard had a reputation problem, seen as an old, outdated brand for people who'd stopped caring about what was current. To shake that image, the company unveiled the Pan-American concept at the 1952 auto shows, which eventually evolved into a production model, the Packard Caribbean. The Caribbean was convertible only from 1953 through 1955, with a hardtop added in its final year of 1956. The car wore chrome trim running the length of the body, deeply cut rear wheel openings, and a 2-sided leather interior, one side for summer, the other in cloth for winter. Starting in 1955, Packard fitted it with the torsion-level suspension, an electronically controlled 4-wheel torsion bar system that self-leveled the car, something almost nobody else in America was doing at the time. The 1956 convertible carried a price of $5,995, making it the second most expensive car on the entire American market behind only the Continental Mark II. But behind all that polish sat a genuine mechanical headache. The oil pump on the new V8 wasn't strong enough, starving the valve train of lubrication. The self-leveling suspension also failed constantly due to poor ground connections. Those problems, combined with the sky-high price, badly damaged the Caribbean's reputation. Packard shut down its Detroit plant in August of 1956. That final year, only 276 convertibles and 263 hardtops rolled off the line. After that, the 1957 and 1958 Packards were really just rebadged Studebakers. 1956 to 1957 DeSoto Adventurer. DeSoto was always squeezed between Dodge and Chrysler in the corporate lineup, a mid-tier brand that was easy to overlook. To carve out its own identity, DeSoto launched the Adventurer in 1956, a limited production high-performance model built to go head-to-head with Chrysler's own 300-letter series. The 1956 version ran a 341 cubic inch Hemi rated at 320 horsepower, strong enough to earn it the honor of pacing the Indianapolis 500 that same year. By 1957, the engine grew to 345 cubic inches and put out exactly 345 horsepower, hitting the magic number of 1 horsepower per cubic inch. That made it, by most accounts, the first standard American production car to hit that ratio without requiring any extra cost option package. The Adventurer only came in 2 color combinations, white with gold accents or black with gold accents. No third option. DeSoto wanted anyone glancing across the showroom floor to recognize an Adventurer instantly, no confusion with anything else on the lot. Production in 1956 landed at just 996 units. By 1957, that climbed to 1,950, including 300 newly added convertibles. But that momentum didn't last. The 1958 recession hit the entire American auto industry hard, and DeSoto ended up one of the hardest-hit brands of all. By November of 1960, Chrysler officially pulled the plug on DeSoto, closing the book on 33 years for a brand that once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Chrysler 300. 1955 Imperial. For decades, Imperial was simply Chrysler's top trim, sitting right next to the New Yorker on the showroom floor. But in 1955, Chrysler made a bold move and spun Imperial off into its own standalone mark, dropping the Chrysler name entirely off the car. The goal was clear: go straight after Cadillac and Lincoln, not the mid-tier competition like Buick or Oldsmobile anymore. The 1955 Imperial introduced a signature look that would define the brand all the way through 1962, round tail lights detached from the fender, ringed in bright chrome. The flagship, the Crown Imperial Limousine, came with a partition window between driver and passengers and rear-facing folding jump seats. Only 172 of those limousines were built that year. Prices ranged from $4,483 to $7,095 depending on trim. Production in 1955 hit 11,430 units, nearly double what it had been the year before as a Chrysler model. That sounds like real progress, but set it next to Cadillac, which sold over 140,000 cars that same year, and Imperial's numbers looked painfully small. Imperial stayed a standalone mark through 1975, then made a brief return from 1981 to 1983 before disappearing for good. Today, most people only remember Imperial as a fancy Chrysler trim level, not a brand that once tried to stand entirely on its own. 1956 to 1958. Duel Ghia. Eugene Casserole was a trucking magnate who shipped cars for a living with no automotive engineering background whatsoever. But when Chrysler decided not to put its Ghia-designed firebomb concept into production, Casserole spotted an opportunity and bought the whole idea outright. The way he ran production sounds like a logistical joke. Dodge D500 chassis were built in Detroit, then shipped by sea to Turin, Italy. There, Ghia's craftsmen shortened the frame, hand-built the body, finished the interior, and shipped everything back to Detroit to have Chrysler's Hemi engines installed. People joked that it was the world's longest production line. Chrysler later borrowed the same trick for its Imperial limousines, and General Motors copied the formula when it partnered with Pininfarina on the Cadillac Alante. The price came in around $7,500, about $200 more than a Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz. At that price, the dual Ghia became a favorite toy of the Hollywood crowd. Frank Sinatra bought one as a gift for Ava Gardner. Dean Martin, Desi Arnaz, and Sammy Davis Jr. each owned one. Even two future presidents, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, ordered the convertible version. The cost of shipping parts across an ocean and back just wasn't sustainable, and by 1958, Dodge stopped supplying the D500 chassis, leaving Casserole with nothing to build on. The entire dual Ghia run stopped at 117 cars, 115 of them convertibles. Today, only about 30 are known to still exist anywhere in the world. 1956 to 1957 Continental Mark II. Ford did something no American automaker had ever done before, creating an entirely separate division, Continental, just to build a single model. Heading it up was William Clay Ford, son of Edsel Ford and grandson of Henry Ford, driven by one clear ambition: prove that Ford could build a luxury car on par with the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud and the Bentley Continental. The Mark II debuted at the 1955 Paris Auto Show rather than anywhere in the United States, a deliberate choice meant to underline its international standing. Every single car was hand-assembled at its own dedicated plant in Wixom, Michigan. Bolts were torqued to aircraft specifications. Paint was hand-rubbed through multiple layers of lacquer. Every 368 cubic inch V8 engine had to run 6 hours on a dynamometer before it was even installed. The price ran north of $10,000, a figure that made even wealthy buyers pause. Elvis Presley was one of the few who bought one, and the car even showed up in the 1956 film High Society, sharing the screen with Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and Grace Kelly. Ford estimated it lost about $1,000 on every single car sold, since the entire hand-built process cost far more than what customers were paying for it. Ford had originally planned to build around 2,000 cars a year for 5 straight years. In reality, only 1,325 were sold in 1956, and that number dropped to just 444 in 1957. In total, 3,005 Continental Mark IIs ever existed, prototypes included, before Ford shut the entire Continental division down. 1957 Mercury Monterey M335. If you think the 1957 Mercury lineup was just the turnpike cruiser with its odd rear window and push-button transmission straight out of a science fiction movie, you're missing the more interesting part of the story. While Chevrolet and Chrysler were making headlines with fuel injection and the Hemi, Mercury quietly shipped a batch of Monterey two-door sedans down to Long Beach, California, handed them over to a man named Bill Strop, and told him to turn them into something that could compete in NASCAR. The goal was straightforward: build 100 units to satisfy homologation requirements, then put them on the track. The engine Strop used was the Lincoln 368 cubic inch Y-block V8, not Mercury's standard power plant. The Lincoln Y-block had tighter assembly tolerances, and Strop blueprinted every single block in his shop before installation. On top of that went dual Holley 4-barrel carburetors, a high-lift Isky camshaft, mechanical lifters, and a heavy-duty rear axle. The result was 335 horsepower hiding inside a sedan that looked completely unremarkable from the outside. Every M335 had its production number stamped directly onto the intake manifold. Car number 33 of those 100 later showed up at Mecum and sold for $77,000, which is not bad for a car that most people buying new vehicles in 1957 had never heard of. The program didn't last long. When NASCAR tightened its rulebook during the 1957 season, the M335 lost its reason to exist on the track before it ever had a real chance to prove what it could do. 1957 Chrysler 300C. Of all the performance cars that came out in 1957, the Chrysler 300C was the only one that was completely upfront about what it was. It walked into the showroom with a Hemi chrome everywhere, and a footprint large enough that nobody could mistake it for anything else, making it clear this was the most powerful car in its class. The press called it the Beautiful Brute, and Chrysler had no objections. The engine was a 392 cubic inch Hemi V8, the largest Hemi Chrysler had ever placed in a mass production vehicle up to that point. With dual 4-barrel carburetors, a 9.25-to-1 compression ratio, and a high-lift camshaft, it produced 375 horsepower and 420 foot-pounds of torque. Those numbers in 1957 were not something to take lightly in a car weighing over 4,000 pounds. Before the 300C officially launched, Chrysler took a mildly modified version to the Chelsea Proving Grounds in Michigan and recorded an average speed of 145.7 miles per hour. Later at Daytona, the high-output 390 horsepower version of the same engine ran the flying mile at a top speed of 134 miles per hour. Chrysler knew what they had and saw no reason to be modest about it. Big car, big engine, high price, and completely open about all of it. That was the identity of the 300C, and it never changed throughout the decade. The 300C was also Motor Trend's Car of the Year for 1957, one of the few genuine performance cars to receive that honor during this era, rather than simply appearing at a drag strip and fading from public memory. 1957 Rambler Rebel. In 1957, American Motors was the brand people turned to when they wanted to save money on gas. Under CEO George Romney, AMC had built its reputation on being practical, compact, and unpretentious. That was their identity, and they knew it well. But two engineers named Jim Moore and Carl Chakmakian weren't entirely satisfied with that. The 1957 Rambler had a relatively lightweight 4-door unibody platform. AMC had also just introduced a new 327 cubic inch V8, originally designed for the larger and heavier Nash and Hudson models. They took that engine, dropped it into a body that was about 300 pounds lighter, upgraded the suspension with heavy-duty shocks and thicker anti-roll bars, and called the result the Rambler Rebel. AMC didn't have the budget to develop a proper halo car, but this formula didn't require much of one. The Rebel was a 4-door hardtop sedan with a 327 cubic inch V8, 255 horsepower, and 345 foot-pounds of torque at just 2,600 revolutions per minute. Only 1,500 were ever built, and AMC brought one out to the Daytona Speed Trials early in 1957 to see what it could do. Motor Trend recorded a 0 to 60 time of 7.5 seconds, quicker than the Chrysler 300C in the same test, and second only to the fuel-injected Corvette in a 4-door Rambler. Anyone standing next to a Corvette at the drag strip that day probably had to read the results twice. AMC didn't follow through with the Rebel after that year. Romney made the call to go back to the fuel economy strategy, and the Rebel became a one-time experiment, fast, rare, and almost completely forgotten. 1957 Chevrolet 150 Black Widow. In 1957, General Motors officially wanted nothing to do with racing. That was the public position after the Automobile Manufacturers Association issued guidelines restricting factory involvement in motorsport. GM signed on and announced they were complying. At the same time, an engineer named Vince Piggins, formerly the lead race engineer at Hudson, was running a company called the Southern Engineering Development Company, or SEDCO, operating out of the Nally Chevrolet dealership in Atlanta, Georgia, with funding that traced back to Chevrolet engineering. SEDCO received 6 Chevrolet 150 utility sedans from Detroit. These were the cheapest, lightest vehicles in the entire 1957 Chevrolet lineup. No radio, no armrests, no cigarette lighter, no rear seat in some versions. Piggins and his team installed a 283 cubic inch small block V8 with Rochester fuel injection in each one, making 283 horsepower, the same figure Chevrolet was promoting loudly on the Corvette. Add in 6 lug wheels, a 20-gallon fuel tank, and a full heavy-duty suspension and brake package. The 6 cars were painted black and white and sent to NASCAR. People called them the Black Widow. Piggins also put together an instruction manual that went out to over 400 Chevrolet dealerships nationwide, explaining how anyone could build their own Black Widow using 170 GM parts available over the counter. The result of that entire program was Buck Baker becoming the NASCAR Grand National Champion in 1957, back-to-back, driving a Chevrolet that GM officially had nothing to do with. Vince Piggins later returned to Chevrolet and became the man behind the Camaro Z28. Whatever he learned from the Black Widow program clearly didn't go to waste. 1957 DeSoto Adventurer. Not many people remember that before the Chevrolet Corvette got all the credit for achieving 1 horsepower per cubic inch, DeSoto had already done it first, and done it on a mass production car with standard equipment, no options or race packages required. The 1957 DeSoto Adventurer used a 345 cubic inch Hemi V8 with dual 4-barrel carburetors, producing exactly 345 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute. 1 horsepower for every cubic inch, nothing more, nothing less. The National DeSoto Club recognizes this as the first American mass production car to hit that benchmark with a standard power plant. Chrysler missed the PR opportunity entirely and let Chevrolet own that story in the public memory. The Adventurer was also not a car for everyday buyers. Only 1,950 were produced that year, with just 300 of them being convertibles, starting at $4,272, considerably more expensive than a Chevrolet Bel Air in the same year. Virgil Exner's forward-look design on the Adventurer was named the best-styled car in the entire Chrysler lineup for 1957 by Mechanics Illustrated, with tall tail fins, triple tail lamps, and gold accents running throughout. But 1957 was also the last high point for DeSoto. Chrysler Corporation had serious quality control problems that year. Cars were leaving dealerships with water leaks, doors that didn't fit right, and uneven paint. DeSoto's sales dropped 70% the following year, and the brand disappeared entirely in November 1960. The 1957 Adventurer was the peak of that brand, and also the last time the DeSoto name carried enough weight to make people pay attention. 1957 Ford Custom Phase 1 Supercharged. A 1957 Ford Custom 2-door sedan looked like nothing from the outside. The lowest trim in the Ford lineup, steel wheels, minimal chrome, a plain interior, the kind of car someone drives to work and parks without anyone looking twice. But Robert McNamara, then general manager of Ford Division, had launched an engine development program in late 1956 with a clear objective: answer Chevrolet's fuel injection on the NASCAR circuit, and that ordinary-looking Custom was the vehicle he chose to carry it. Instead of pursuing fuel injection, Ford went with a supercharger, specifically the McCulloch FR57 centrifugal supercharger bolted onto the 312 cubic inch V8. Street rating was 300 horsepower. The NASCAR race spec version pushed that number to 340 horsepower. The program required 100 units to satisfy homologation. Ford split the production run into 65 Ford Custom 2-door sedans, 20 convertibles, and 15 Thunderbirds. All were hand-built. Those custom sedans, the Phase 1 cars, were chosen because they were the lightest, cheapest option in the lineup, and their appearance gave absolutely no suggestion of anything related to a race car, which Ford considered an advantage. But before the program could prove anything on the track, NASCAR tightened its regulations during the 1957 season and banned both superchargers and fuel injection. Ford had built the cars, had the plan, had the drivers, and then everything stopped. Only about 3 Phase 1 custom sedans are confirmed to exist today. 1957 Ford Thunderbird F-Code. Of the 21,380 Thunderbirds produced in 1957, only 212 carried the F-Code, the letter in the VIN that identified the presence of a McCulloch Paxton VR 57 centrifugal supercharger on the 312 cubic inch V8. Street rating was 300 horsepower, less than 1% of total production, and most people buying a Thunderbird that year had no idea these cars existed. The Thunderbird was never positioned by Ford as a pure sports car in the way the Corvette was. Ford emphasized comfort, style, and daily livability. That's why they called it a personal car rather than a sports car. The Corvette was for people who wanted to go to the track. The Thunderbird was for people who wanted to look good pulling up to a restaurant and still be able to leave most things behind on the highway, if the situation called for it. The F code shifted that equation somewhat. The supercharger pushed 300 horsepower into a car that was noticeably lighter and smaller than the 300C, and the result was a Thunderbird that could have a serious conversation with the Corvette about performance while keeping its upscale interior and comfortable two-seat cabin intact. 15. Phase 1. Thunderbirds were hand-built on January 25, 1957, and taken to the Daytona Speed Trials, where one of them recorded a speed of 138.755 miles per hour, breaking the American sports car record and improving on the previous year's mark held by Corvette by 6 miles per hour. Ford didn't use fuel injection. Ford used boost, and at least for one day at Daytona in 1957, that turned out to be the better answer. 1957 Chevrolet Corvette, 283 fuel injection. Before 1957, the Corvette was a good-looking car that nobody on a racetrack was particularly afraid of. Fiberglass body, 2 seats, striking styling, but the performance wasn't there yet to make it something competitors genuinely worried about. That changed in 1957. Chevrolet bored the small block out to 283 cubic inches and offered Rochester Ramjet fuel injection as an option on the Corvette for the first time. The system was designed by engineer John Dolza and was considerably simpler and more reliable than the Bendix Electrojector that Chrysler and AMC were struggling with at the same time. The top version produced exactly 283 horsepower at 6,200 revolutions per minute, 1 horsepower per cubic inch, a benchmark that automotive magazines at the time treated as a genuine engineering milestone. Road and Track tested a 283/283 car with a 4-speed manual and recorded 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds, the quarter mile in 14.3 seconds, and a top speed of 132 miles per hour. The magazine wrote that those figures were unequaled by any other production sports car at the time. Only 756 Corvettes were built with the 283 horsepower fuel-injected engine out of 6,339 total produced that year, and each one cost an extra $500 for the fuel injection option, roughly equivalent to a month's average wages for an American worker in 1957. The significance of this car goes beyond the numbers. The Corvette 283 Fuelie is the reason Ford turned to superchargers, the reason Chrysler brought up Chelsea Proving Grounds, the reason AMC quietly hauled the Rebel down to Daytona. When a 2-seat roadster with a fiberglass body starts running 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds, everything else on this list had to find an answer. Zora Arkus Duntov, the Belgian-born engineer of Russian origin who was responsible for much of the Corvette's development during this period, understood that 1957 was the year the Corvette stopped being a pretty car and started being a genuine threat. He was right. 1951 GM LeSabre. The LeSabre debuted in 1951, and to understand it, you need to know what was on Harley Earl's mind at the time, the F-86 Sabre fighter jet. The entire shape of the car, from the pointed nose to the tail fins flaring up at the rear, echoed the lines of that fighter plane. The body was built from aluminum and magnesium, light enough that GM's own engineers weren't used to working at that scale yet. Under the hood sat a supercharged 215 cubic inch aluminum V8, putting out 335 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute and 381 pound-feet of torque at a time when Cadillac's most powerful V8 was sitting around 160 horsepower. The LeSabre also ran a dual-fuel setup capable of running on both gasoline and methanol with 2 separate tanks, because Earl wanted to test performance on both. A powerful engine makes sense on a show car, but the smaller details are what really stop you in your tracks. The LeSabre had hydraulic jacks built right into the body so you could change a tire without a jack handle, heated seats, headlight covers that opened electrically, and a rain sensor that automatically raised the convertible top if it started raining while the car sat alone. Heated seats and rain sensors in 1951 were features most cars wouldn't get as common options until almost the year 2000. What set the LeSabre apart from most dream cars is that Earl didn't just show it off and lock it away. He actually drove it every day for over 2 years, putting more than 45,000 miles on it like a daily commuter. The LeSabre also left behind an important design legacy. The wraparound windshield it pioneered later showed up on the 1953 Cadillac Eldorado and the Oldsmobile Fiesta. 1954 Firebird 1. Unveiled in 1954, the Firebird 1 was the first gas turbine car ever built and tested in the United States. A single seat, a clear bubble canopy, a fiberglass body shaped after the Douglas Skyray fighter jet, and a vertical tail fin sticking up behind it like a miniature fighter plane riding on 4 wheels. At its core was the Whirlfire engine, producing 370 horsepower at 13,000 revolutions per minute on the power turbine, while the front compressor turbine spun up to 26,000 revolutions per minute. Exhaust gases left the car at 1,250 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt plenty of ordinary metals. GM estimated a top speed north of 200 miles per hour, a number that to this day remains purely theoretical, since the car was only ever tested up to around 100 miles per hour in real conditions. The brakes matched that aviation mindset perfectly. The drums sat on the outside of the wheels for faster cooling, while aircraft-style flaps could pop up to create drag and help slow the car down at high speed. This car was dangerous enough that only one engineer, Emmett Conklin, was initially cleared to drive it. During one test run, when he shifted into second gear, the turbine's massive torque caused the rear wheels to completely lose traction, and Conklin had to back off immediately to keep from losing control. The Firebird 1 was only the first chapter in a 3-generation turbine program, Firebird 1, 2, and 3, completely unrelated to the later Pontiac Firebird muscle car, even though both wore the GM badge. 1954 Pontiac Bonneville Special. In 1954, Harley Earl traveled to the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah to watch land speed record runs. He came back to Detroit with an idea and handed it to Pontiac, a brand that had never come close to anything sporty before. The result was the Bonneville Special, Pontiac's first ever 2-seat sports car. Under the hood was a 268 cubic inch inline 8, tuned with 4 2-barrel carburetors, a high compression head, and a performance camshaft, producing 230 horsepower through a 4-speed Hydra-Matic automatic transmission. The body was fiberglass, built on a chassis based on the 1953 Corvette, the same platform underpinning Chevrolet's brand-new sports car that year. The look is what really stops people in their tracks. A plexiglass canopy covers the entire cabin with gull-wing doors that swing up like wings. Out back, a Continental kit shaped like a jet exhaust turns the entire rear end into a statement about speed. Pontiac built exactly 2 of these, one in bronze, one in green, so they could be displayed at 2 different shows at the same time, one in Los Angeles and one in Detroit. Both cars survive to this day, a rare outcome for Motorama dream cars, which were usually destroyed once the tour wrapped up. One of the 2 was later sold at Barrett-Jackson, with under 800 miles on the odometer, practically untouched since it left the factory. The Bonneville name went on to become Pontiac's full-size performance line starting in 1957, and it stuck around continuously for 47 years, making it one of the longest-running nameplates in American automotive history. 1953 to 1954, Oldsmobile F88. Between 1952 and 1953, Oldsmobile was quietly working on its own answer to the Corvette. That car was the F-88, a two-seat roadster with a fiberglass body sitting on an early Corvette chassis. The engine was a tuned version of the Rocket V8 pulled from the 1954 Oldsmobile Super 88, putting out around 250 horsepower, paired with a 4-speed Hydra-Matic automatic and a Corvette rear axle. When the 1955 Corvette switched to a 225 horsepower V8, Earl ordered a second F-88 built with a supercharged engine, pushing output to 370 horsepower. The design came out of the Oldsmobile studio under Art Ross, the same man who had designed Cadillac's legendary grille back in 1941. Bill Mitchell, Ken Pickering, and a name every Corvette fan knows, Zora Arkus Duntov, all worked on the project. The second F-88 stood just 53.1 inches tall, with a removable fiberglass top similar to the later 1956 Corvette. The F-88 never made it to a showroom. Chevrolet, GM's biggest sales contributor by far, worried that a sporty Oldsmobile would compete directly with the Corvette, and convinced the board to kill the whole project. Only one F-88 survives today. In 2005, it sold at Barrett-Jackson for $3.24 million, a number that makes a lot of people stop and wonder what Oldsmobile lost by letting this project die before it ever got started. 1956, Buick Centurion. This is the car from the opening, the Buick Centurion that debuted at the 1956 Motorama alongside the Pontiac Club de Mer. Its backup camera was a real working device built by University Broadcasting System, weighing around 6 pounds, mounted in the rear and feeding a small screen on the dashboard in place of a traditional rearview mirror. The body was fiberglass, and the Centurion's bubble canopy was the largest fully transparent roof ever built at the time, wrapping around the entire cabin like a fighter jet cockpit. Inside, the steering wheel was mounted cantilever style, dead center on the dashboard, exactly like the layout of an aircraft cockpit. Under the hood sat a 325 horsepower V8. The Centurion's front seat slid back automatically every time the doors opened, making it easier to get in and out. And this is considered one of the earliest steps toward bucket seats, which would later become standard across American cars. The rear featured a wing fender design, fin-like shapes running along the body, and those lines directly influenced the tail designs of the 1959 Chevrolet and Buick 3 years later. The Centurion is now held by the Sloan Museum, and the backup camera it carried was 35 years ahead of its time, long before that technology became standard on cars. 1956 Pontiac Club de Mer. Also at the 1956 Motorama, standing next to the Centurion and the Oldsmobile Golden Rocket, was a small, low, metallic blue roadster that GM Design called a rolling design laboratory. That was the Pontiac Club de Mer, designed by Paul Gillian. The body was brushed aluminum, and the entire car stood just about 38 inches tall, lower than even the Corvette of that era. Under the hood was a Stratostreak V8, roughly 287 cubic inches, producing 300 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque through dual 4-barrel carburetors. The drivetrain used a rear transaxle paired with independent rear suspension, a layout almost no American automaker was using at the time. Up front, 2 parallel chrome silver streak strips ran down the hood, the first time Pontiac had ever used 2 parallel streaks on one car. The nose could rotate a full 180 degrees to reveal hidden headlights underneath. Out back, a single massive tail fin rose up like a shark's fin, while the cabin was wrapped in vermilion red leather with twin plexiglass Cafe Racer windscreens shielding the driver and passenger. The Club de Mer toured 5 cities in 1956, drawing roughly 2.2 million visitors, a record year for the Motorama. By late 1958, the original car was destroyed. Even so, Harley Earl held on to a quarter-scale model of the Club de Mer, motorized it, and turned it into a pedal car for his grandson, a kid named Tiger. In the 2000s, a restoration team built a full-size replica on a 1959 Pontiac chassis, recreating the original shape almost exactly, starting from a child's toy. 1959 Cadillac Cyclone. In 1959, Harley Earl was getting ready to retire after more than 3 decades running GM's design department, and his last dream car was the Cadillac Cyclone, unveiled at Daytona Speedway. The Cyclone was based on a shortened 1959 Cadillac Series 62 chassis, cut down to a 104-inch wheelbase. A 390 cubic inch V8 producing 325 horsepower sat up front, while a Hydra-matic transmission paired with a 2-speed differential sat in the rear, giving it 6 forward speeds total. It also used Saginaw rotary valve power steering, the first time that system had appeared on a GM car. The front end carried 2 pointed cones known as Dagmars, and each one hid a radar unit. The radar scanned the road ahead, measured distance and stopping distance, and warned the driver with both a sound and a light if it detected an obstacle. The same basic idea behind the collision warning systems on modern cars, just 60 years early. The Cyclone's plexiglass canopy could automatically rise when a sensor detected rain, and when not in use, it folded away and tucked under the rear trunk lid. The door slid outward 3 inches on ball bearings before opening, the kind of mechanical precision very few show cars of that era could pull off. After Earl retired, Bill Mitchell took over and reworked the Cyclone's design, shortening the fins, removing the canopy, and changing the paint from pearl white to silver. That revised version became known as the 1964 Cadillac Cyclone. 1953 Buick Wildcat 1. In 1953, at the very same Motorama where the Corvette and the Firebird 1 made their debuts, Buick showed up with the Wildcat 1, one of the brand's first fiberglass cars, built mainly to test out the new material. The engine was a 322 cubic inch Fireball V8, producing 188 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute, paired with a 3-speed Dynaflow automatic. The Wildcat 1 stretched 218.7 inches long on a 123-inch wheelbase and measured 78 inches wide, a low, long 2-seat roadster in classic dream car proportions. A concave grille with the Wildcat emblem at its center, combined with buffer bombs built into a massive wraparound front bumper, gave the car its signature face. The front wheels wore rotostatic hubcaps with centers that stayed stationary while the wheels spun, doubling as cooling discs that fed a constant stream of air to the front brakes. Twin hood scoops fed extra air to the carburetor. The doors opened with push buttons, while the windows and seats ran on hydraulics. The top folded hydraulically, too, disappearing completely under a rear panel, with no need for a boot like a normal convertible. In back, a row of 15 vertical slats decorated the fenders. Dual exhausts ran straight through the tail, and the taillights wrapped over the top of the rear fenders. Buick called the Wildcat 1 an experimental car in its own materials that year, but by 1954, that same concave grille and wraparound front bumper showed up on Buick's mass production lineup. Joseph Bortz added this car to his collection in the mid-1980s, after it narrowly avoided getting crushed like most dream cars of its era. The Wildcat 1 is now on display at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. All 8 of these cars came out between 1951 and 1959, right at the peak of Harley Earl's power at GM. 1953 Buick Skylark. In 1953, Buick turned 50 years old. The company celebrated by putting a nearly hand-built convertible on sale for $5,000, more than they'd ever charged for even their top Roadmaster. They called it the Skylark. To put that price in perspective, $5,000 in 1953 was enough to buy a modest house out in the American countryside. It started with a handful of sketches by Ned Nichols, Buick's head of styling, who had reworked his own personal convertible along the lines of the California custom scene that was blowing up at the time. Harley Earl, the man who ran design across all of General Motors, saw those drawings and liked them well enough to push the car straight into production, cutting the portholes that had been Buick's calling card for years. General Manager Ivan Wiles gave it the green light, and the Skylark was born. Each car had the original owner's name engraved directly onto the steering wheel hub, which made it feel less like a car purchase and more like commissioning a piece of custom jewelry. Under the hood sat Buick's brand-new 322 cubic-inch V8, nicknamed the Nailhead, rated at 188 horsepower. Buick called it a sports car, and honestly, that was a stretch. A car that big and that heavy was never going to be mistaken for a sports car by anyone who'd actually driven one in Europe. Only 1,690 Skylarks were ever sold. That same year, General Motors launched two more limited edition cars built around the exact same concept, and collectors would later call all three together the Triple Crown. 1953 Oldsmobile Fiesta. The second car in that Triple Crown came from Oldsmobile, and it turned out to be considerably rarer than the Skylark. The name was Fiesta, built on the top-of-the-line 98 platform, with a sticker price of $5,715, nearly double what a standard 98 convertible cost that same year. Oldsmobile fitted the Fiesta with something no car in their lineup had ever offered before: a panoramic wraparound windshield that curved around at both ends and sat 3 full inches lower than the standard glass. The spinner hubcaps that came on the Fiesta ended up influencing American custom car culture for years after the car was gone. Underneath the hood was a specially tuned version of the Rocket V8, 303 cubic inches, bumped up to 170 horsepower, 5 more than the regular engine, which was Oldsmobile's way of making clear this wasn't just a 98 with a fresh coat of paint. Two-tone leather was standard from the factory, along with a full suite of power accessories that other Oldsmobiles charged extra for. Oldsmobile's advertising that year flat-out called the Fiesta the most luxurious and powerful car they'd ever produced, and in this case, the marketing actually matched the product. Just 458 Fiestas sold during the one and only model year it existed. Historians of the period sometimes describe it as an expensive disappointment on dealer floors, since the price drove most buyers straight to a standard 98 at half the money. That commercial failure is precisely what makes the Fiesta the scarcest car of GM's 1953 Triple Crown, even rarer than the Skylark that started this whole conversation. 1956 Packard Caribbean. Before the Second World War, Packard was mentioned in the same breath as Peerless and Pierce Arrow as one of the 3 Ps at the very top of American luxury motoring. By the mid-1950s, the brand was losing ground fast to Cadillac and Lincoln, and it had started to carry a reputation for being old-fashioned and out of touch. The company turned to Dick Teague, a young designer who'd earned the nickname Wizard of Facelifts, and asked him to build a convertible using the Pan American show car that had wowed crowds at the 1952 New York Auto Show as a jumping-off point. The result was the Caribbean, which arrived in 1953 and got refined with every passing year. The 1956 model we're talking about today was priced at $5,995, with a total of only 276 built. Packard's most powerful production V8 ever sat under that hood, 374 cubic inches, making 310 horsepower. Inside the car was a genuinely peculiar feature that almost no other manufacturer ever tried. The seat cushions were reversible, leather on one face for summer driving and cloth on the other for winter. Just 10 of those 276 cars were ordered with factory air conditioning. The real question was whether a $5,995 convertible could rescue a brand that was already in serious trouble. The Caribbean cost nearly $2,000 more than a Cadillac convertible that year, a bold position for a company that was quietly fighting for survival. Packard had already merged with Studebaker in 1954, and within 2 years of this Caribbean reaching showrooms, the Packard nameplate would be gone from Detroit manufacturing floors permanently. 1956 to 1957 dual Ghia convertible. Eugene Casserole ran Dual Motors Corporation in Detroit, a business that had built its reputation making military trucks and industrial power generators. In 1956, he decided to enter the luxury car market using an approach no American company had tried before. Dodge supplied the chassis and drivetrain, which then went by ship to Italy, where Carrozzeria Ghia in Turin hand-built the entire body before shipping everything back to Detroit for interior fitting and final finishing. Casserole described it as the longest production line on Earth, and Chrysler would eventually copy the same method for their Imperial Limousine program. The dual Ghia went on sale for around $7,600, which put it nearly $200 above a Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz from the same period. A Dodge Hemi V8, 315 cubic inches, handled the power, which was respectable, but never really the car's main argument. The real sell was the combination of Italian coachwork over an American drivetrain, and the Hollywood crowd went absolutely wild for it. Frank Sinatra owned one, Dean Martin owned one, Desi Arnaz, Richard Nixon, and a roster of other major American names from that decade all turned up as registered owners of a dual Ghia at one point or another. Casserole's plan had called for 150 cars a year, but the complexity of hand-building each one meant that total output across all 3 production years came to just around 117 cars. Every single unit sold at a loss, and by 1958, Dual Motors had no choice but to close down entirely. 1956 Continental Mark II. William Clay Ford was just 30 years old in 1952 when Ford Motor Company handed him a project unlike anything else in the company's portfolio. As the son of Edsel Ford and grandson of Henry Ford himself, he put together a tight-knit team, bringing in John Reinhardt, who had previously styled Packards, as chief designer, Gordon Buehrig, creator of the legendary Cord 810, as chief body engineer, and Harley Kopp as the lead mechanical engineer. The brief they were working to was to produce an American car that could genuinely stand beside a Rolls-Royce without needing to make excuses. Could a small team like that deliver something worth close to $10,000? The Continental Mark II was their answer, introduced in late 1955 for the 1956 model year. Every car received 4 coats of lacquer, each layer hand-sanded before the next one went down. Assembly workers were specifically encouraged to report even minor defects before any car left the plant. The only option on the order sheet was air conditioning at $595, because everything else was already included as standard. Let's be straight about the numbers. Ford lost roughly $1,000 on every Mark II it moved, which is not the kind of math that sits well in any boardroom. Total production reached 2,550 for 1956 and another 444 for 1957 before the program ended. Throughout that run, the Mark II held the record as the most expensive mass-produced American car in history, at least until Cadillac came along with something even more ambitious. The human stories behind the Mark II are worth knowing. William Clay Ford spent decades as the owner of the Detroit Lions in the NFL, and Harley Kopp, the chief engineer on this very project, became a central and controversial figure 20 years later when he went public with damaging testimony during the Ford Pinto fuel tank case, one of the most debated product liability episodes in the history of the American auto industry. 1953 Cunningham C3. Briggs. Cunningham came from swift meatpacking money, had won the America's Cup sailing race, and had enough personal wealth to do essentially whatever he wanted with his time. What he wanted was to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans in a car built by Americans. The race rules of the era required at least 25 production units to compete in the production car category, and that regulation is the entire reason the Cunningham C3 was ever built. Chassis fabrication happened at Cunningham's own facility in West Palm Beach, Florida, at a pace of roughly 1 per week. Each completed frame then crossed the Atlantic to Turin, Italy, where Vignale hand-formed the body to an Italian design. Under the hood sat a Chrysler Hemi V8, 331 cubic inches, producing between 210 and 235 horsepower, depending on the state of tune, and capable of pushing the C3 to a top speed somewhere around 135 miles per hour. The original price target had been somewhere in the $8,000 to $9,000 range. That figure didn't hold for long since Vignale's costs kept climbing with each successive batch of cars. The buyers who came through and actually paid for one included members of the DuPont family and members of the Rockefeller family. The total production run was just 25 cars built across 1952, 1953, and 1954. Cunningham's team finished third overall at Le Mans in both 1953 and 1954, which genuinely is a remarkable achievement for a self-funded American effort, though third place was never the outcome Briggs Cunningham had mortgaged his ambitions to achieve. The business lost money on every car. In 1955, the Internal Revenue Service revoked the special tax arrangement that had kept the B.S. Cunningham Company operating, and with that, Briggs Cunningham's career as a car manufacturer was over. 1957 to 1958, Cadillac Eldorado Brougham. By this point, Harley Earl had been the creative force behind General Motors' design for nearly 30 years, and he was not interested in going quietly. Ed Glowacka, Cadillac's chief designer, was the man who took Earl's ambitions and turned them into an actual automobile, working from ideas developed in two concept cars, the Orleans and the Park Avenue, that GM had shown at Motorama in 1953 and 1954. The car that resulted was the Eldorado Brougham, which went on sale in March 1957 for $13,074. It was the first General Motors production car to use 4 headlights, and it came with a brushed stainless steel roof, rear doors that hinged open from the center in a suicide door configuration, and a self-leveling air suspension system. That last feature sounds impressive, and it was until it broke down, which happened often enough that a significant number of owners eventually had it swapped out for conventional coil springs. A 365 cubic inch V8 with dual 4-barrel carburetors provided the power, rated at 325 horsepower. At $13,074, the Eldorado Brougham cost more than any Rolls-Royce available in the American market that year. General Motors absorbed a loss of approximately $10,000 on each car, a figure that dwarfs even the Continental Mark II's $1,000 per car shortfall. It is genuinely difficult to picture a major corporation voluntarily accepting losses on that scale, but Cadillac viewed it as the cost of maintaining the standard of the world reputation the brand had staked out back in 1905. Production came to 400 units for 1957 and 304 for 1958, totaling 704 cars across both years. Harley Earl retired at the close of 1958, ending a 30-year run at the top of American automotive design. Ed Glowacka, the designer who had given shape to this last great Earl-era Cadillac, died of leukemia in 1962 at the age of 41, just 4 years after the Brougham had made its mark. 1958 Imperial Crown Limousine by Ghia. Virgil Exner was heading design at Chrysler and had maintained a close friendship for years with Luigi Segre, president of Carrozzeria Ghia in Turin, Italy. In 1956, Chrysler ran the numbers on building a new limousine body in-house and came back with a retooling bill of more than $3.3 million, which was simply not justifiable for a few hundred cars per year. Exner picked up the phone and called Turin. Paul Farrago, a Chrysler engineer with Italian roots who spoke the language and knew the Ghia workshops intimately, managed the day-to-day relationship between the two companies. The process worked like this. An Imperial hardtop with a reinforced X-frame chassis left Detroit without any interior and made the ocean crossing to Italy, where Ghia craftsmen stretched the body by hand and finished it to the standard of custom coachwork. Chrysler chairman K.T. Keller had an ironclad personal rule for every car the company produced: A man should be able to sit inside wearing his fedora without having to take it off. The finished limousine measured 58.5 inches tall and 244.7 inches long, dimensions built around that rule. The selling price was $15,075, the highest sticker on any American car anywhere in the 1950s. Chrysler called it the world's most magnificent limousine, and the people who bought one were largely heads of state and members of dynasties that had been wealthy for generations. King Saud of Saudi Arabia took delivery of one. President Sukarno of Indonesia did as well. In 1959, one of these cars was selected to carry Queen Elizabeth II during her official visit to Canada. Chrysler built just 31 of them for the 1958 model year, and only 132 total across the full 9-year production span from 1957 through 1965. No American car of the 1950s cost more, not the Eldorado Brougham, not the Continental Mark II, and not any Rolls-Royce that was being sold on American soil during those years. 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 88. In 1949, Oldsmobile did something nobody else in Detroit had the nerve to do. They took their brand new V8 engine, dropped it into a smaller, lighter car, and sold it to regular people at a price regular people could actually afford. The Rocket V8 displaced 303 cubic inches and made 135 horsepower, and it was the first overhead valve V8 engine ever mass-produced in American history. The old design before it, the flathead, placed the valves along the side of the engine block, which choked off airflow in and out of the combustion chamber. Overhead valve moved the valves directly into the cylinder head, improving airflow and bumping compression significantly. The competition at the time was Ford's flathead V8, which managed just 100 horsepower. The Rocket 88 had 35 more horsepower right out of the gate. On the track, the Rocket 88 dominated NASCAR from its very first season. In 1949, it won 6 out of 9 races. In 1950, it won 10 out of 19. That same year, a Rocket 88 took first place at the Carrera Panamericana, a road race stretching over 2,000 miles across Mexico. Sales for 1949 hit 99,276 units in the 88 lineup alone, up 68% from the year before. A musician named Jackie Brenston drew his inspiration from this car to write Rocket 88 in 1951. Many music critics consider it the first rock and roll record ever made. By 1957, nearly every American automaker had switched to overhead valve V8s. Brands like Hudson, Nash, and Packard couldn't keep up, and none of them made it out of the decade. 1951 Chrysler Imperial. Before 1951, steering a 4,000-pound American car through city streets was no small task. Turning the wheel from a dead stop could take 30, even 35 pounds of effort. For a country building bigger and heavier cars every single year, that was a real problem, especially for women and older drivers sitting behind the wheel of those massive American sedans. The system Chrysler developed for the 1951 Imperial was called HydroGuide, and it was the first commercially available power steering system ever fitted to a mass-production automobile. The concept of power steering actually dates back to 1876, but for over 70 years, nobody had managed to make it work in a civilian car. The technology had originally been used to steer heavy armored vehicles on the battlefields of World War II, and after the war, Chrysler was the first automaker to see what it could do on regular streets. HydroGuide was offered as a $226 add-on option on the Imperial and came standard on the Imperial Crown, the most expensive car in Chrysler's entire lineup at the time. $226 in 1951 was serious money, roughly equivalent to $2,800 today. Even so, by 1953, just 2 years after launch, over 1 million American cars had been fitted with power steering. Today, every single car on the road has power-assisted steering. No other feature in automotive history spread that fast. And it all started with one Chrysler Imperial rolling off the assembly line in 1951. 1950 Nash Statesman. In 1950, Nash did something nobody in the industry asked them to do. They installed seatbelts in 40,000 Statesman and Ambassador units straight from the factory, making Nash the first automaker in history to offer seatbelts as standard equipment on a mass production car. Buyers asked their dealers to remove them. Nash reported that after a full year on the market, out of those 40,000 belt-equipped cars, only about 1,000 customers actually used them. The rest either pulled them out entirely or stuffed them down into the seat cushion where they wouldn't have to look at them. Americans in 1950 simply didn't believe they needed protecting behind the wheel. In 1954, the Sports Car Club of America began requiring drivers to wear lap belts during competition. Seat belts found acceptance on the racetrack long before they were welcome on public roads. Things started to shift in 1955 when actor James Dean died in a car crash that many experts believed he would have survived had he been wearing a belt. Ford introduced an optional seat belt on its 1956 models, and within just a few months, 20% of buyers were ordering them from the factory, with another 10% getting them installed at the dealership. In 1958, Volvo engineer Niels Bohlin developed the modern three-point safety belt. Bohlin had previously designed ejection seats for Saab fighter jets, and he applied the same principles to the passenger car. Volvo released the patent to the entire industry for free. By 1968, federal law required seat belts in every new American car, 18 years after those Nash Statesman customers had refused to use them. 1954 Nash Ambassador. Packard was the first automaker to offer air conditioning back in 1939. That sounds impressive until you hear how it actually worked. The entire system sat in the trunk. There was no way to adjust the temperature, and to turn it off, the driver had to pull over, pop the hood, and manually remove the belt from the compressor by hand. Nobody wanted to do that in the middle of a Texas afternoon. Nash Kelvinator had filed a patent for a completely different approach back in 1938, which was granted in 1942. World War II prevented them from putting it into production, but that head start gave Nash an advantage no competitor could match when the time finally came. In 1954, the Nash Ambassador launched with a system called All-Weather Eye, and for the first time in history, the entire heating, cooling, and ventilation system was fully integrated into the dashboard and operated from a single set of controls. It was also the first system to use an electromagnetic clutch on the compressor, which meant you could switch it on and off without touching the belt. That is exactly the same layout every car in the world still uses today. The option was priced at just $395, considerably cheaper than the bulky trunk-mounted systems from GM and Chrysler at the time. Nash also made All-Weather Eye available across their entire product range, from the entry-level Rambler all the way up to the Ambassador. By 1960, air conditioning was installed in 20% of American cars on the road. By 1973, that number had climbed to 70%. 1956 Chrysler New Yorker. Up until the mid-1950s, every car radio ran on vacuum tubes, those fragile little glass cylinders that ate battery power, threw off heat, and failed constantly on the rough roads of post-war America. Listening to music in the car back then was an experience that depended heavily on luck. On April 28, 1955, Chrysler and Philco took out a small announcement in the Wall Street Journal. They had just completed the world's first all-transistor car radio, called the Mopar Model 914HR. Not a single vacuum tube inside, just 11 transistors. Philco built the entire thing at their plant in Sandusky, Ohio, exclusively for Chrysler. The radio was offered as a $150 option on 1956 models, including the New Yorker and Imperial, hitting dealership floors on October 21, 1955. That $150 works out to roughly $1,500 in today's money. Compared to the old vacuum tube units, it used less than 10% of the power, generated no heat, and held up far better on long drives. Chrysler pulled the plug on the model after 1956 because transistors were still more expensive than vacuum tubes at the time. They switched to hybrid radios that mixed both technologies until the early 1960s, when transistor prices dropped far enough to go all transistor again for good. It was a move that put them a full decade ahead of where the market was heading. 1958 Chrysler Imperial. In 1936, Ralph Teeter was riding as a passenger in the car of Harry Lindsay, his attorney and close friend. Lindsay had a habit of speeding up when he was talking and slowing down when he was listening, over and over again, for the entire trip. It annoyed Teeter so much that he made up his mind to invent a device that would hold a car at a steady speed. Here is the part worth knowing. Ralph Teeter had been completely blind in both eyes since the age of 5. He was the first blind engineer on record in the United States, and he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1912. He had never once seen a car in his life, yet he invented one of the most important automotive technologies of the 20th century. Teeter filed his first patent in 1948 and called the device the speedostat. The system read ground speed from the rotating speedometer cable and used a bidirectional electric motor to adjust the throttle position, holding the car at whatever speed the driver had set until they touched the brake pedal. Chrysler was the first automaker to put the speedostat into a production car in 1958, fitting it to the Imperial, New Yorker, and Windsor under the name Autopilot. In 1959, Cadillac licensed the technology and rebranded it Cruise Control. That name has stuck ever since. Teeter passed away in 1982 at the age of 91, holding over 40 patents to his name. In 1988, he was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in Dearborn, Michigan. A man who never drove a car left behind technology that billions of drivers use every single day. 1954 Buick Roadmaster. There is an interesting contradiction running through American automotive history in the 1950s. While engineers were doing everything they could to make cars faster and more powerful, they had almost completely overlooked an equally important question. How do you actually stop one of those things? Power brakes had technically been invented back in 1903, but for the next 50 years, they showed up only on military vehicles and heavy-duty trucks. For a civilian sedan weighing 4,000 pounds doing 70 miles per hour on a newly built highway, hydraulic brakes without any power assist demanded serious leg strength, especially in an emergency. In 1954, Buick made power brakes standard across the entire Roadmaster lineup, one of the most significant steps toward bringing this technology down from the luxury segment into mainstream American cars. That same year, the Roadmaster also came standard with power steering and a 12-volt electrical system, ahead of most other manufacturers in the industry. One piece of context that matters here. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act, launching the construction of 41,000 miles of federal freeway. Average driving speeds across America jumped. Power brakes stopped being a luxury feature overnight and became a genuine matter of safety. By the end of the 1950s, nearly every mid-size American car came with them as standard. 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air. Packard introduced the first hydraulic window lift system on the 180 series back in 1941. That setup used a pump and a network of fluid lines buried in the trunk, leaked constantly, broke down regularly, and was only available on the most expensive cars in America. Ford and Lincoln followed with similar systems on select high-end models over the next few years. Chrysler took a completely different approach with the 1951 Imperial. They scrapped the pump and all the plumbing entirely, replacing them with 4 small self-contained electric motors, 1 per door. The new system was significantly more reliable and far easier to maintain than anything that had come before it. GM, Ford, and Chevrolet all followed suit in 1954. What makes the 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air worth calling out specifically is what it represented. Chevrolet was not a luxury brand. This was the family car of middle-class America, with a starting price of $1,684. And yet power windows were available as an option on the Bel Air that year, marking the first time the feature had stepped outside the luxury segment entirely. Chevrolet built 486,240 Bel Airs in 1954, accounting for more than 42% of the company's total production. By the 1960s, Cadillac Fleetwood had made power windows standard across its entire lineup. By the early 1980s, nearly every American car had them, from full-size pickup trucks down to the most basic sedans on the market. 1954 to 1955. Kaiser Manhattan. Kaiser Frazer was born in the post-war boom, riding the wave of pent-up demand for new cars, and for a brief window, they genuinely competed with the Big Three. But by the early 1950s, the game had shifted. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler were rolling out new overhead valve V8 engines that were lighter and significantly more powerful. Kaiser was still running a 226 cubic inch L-head inline-six that traced its roots back to Continental, putting out exactly 118 horsepower. In a market where horsepower was becoming the only language that mattered, 118 horsepower was the wrong answer. Kaiser had no budget to develop a new V8, and rather than surrender, they went looking for Robert Paxton McCulloch. McCulloch was a Stanford-trained engineer who had been developing his centrifugal supercharger since the late 1930s. His VS57 unit was straightforward. Belt-driven building boost above 3,000 revolutions per minute, compact and reliable enough to bolt onto a production car. Kaiser fitted it to the old 6, kept boost at a conservative 4 pounds per square inch for reliability, and output jumped from 118 horsepower to 140 horsepower. That might not sound like much against the V8s flooding the market at the time, but Kaiser was not trying to win the horsepower race. They just needed to stay in the game for one more year. Kaiser marketed the 1954 Manhattan as two engines in one, economy combined with energy. 0 to 60 miles per hour improved from 17.5 seconds down to around 15 seconds with the manual transmission. Every engine was carefully inspected component by component before leaving the factory, making these arguably the most thoroughly quality-controlled engines Kaiser ever produced. Several thousand supercharged Manhattans were built before Kaiser shut down its American passenger car operations in 1955. The supercharger did not save Kaiser, but it earned them something no other brand had in 1954, the title of the first American post-war production car to offer a factory-installed supercharger as standard equipment. A small footnote in history, but one that Kaiser fully deserved. 1957 Packard Clipper. Packard had once been one of the greatest luxury car brands in America. Before the war, if you drove a Packard, people knew who you were. But by the mid-1950s, Studebaker Packard Corporation was drowning in debt and consolidated production at the Studebaker plant in South Bend, Indiana. Packard was no longer designing its own cars. The new Packard for 1957 was essentially a Studebaker President with a restyled face, extra chrome, a Packard badge slapped on, and sent to the showroom. Critics called it the Packard Baker, and nobody could argue otherwise. But as embarrassing as the origins were, all 4,809 Packard Clippers built in 1957 came with a Studebaker 289 cubic inch V8, fitted with a factory McCulloch VS57 supercharger, producing 275 horsepower at 4,800 revolutions per minute. That was the only engine on offer. No alternatives, no options. You bought a 1957 Packard Clipper, you got the supercharged V8, whether you wanted it or not. And here is the detail that makes this car more interesting than most people realize. 869 of those 4,809 units were the country sedan station wagon, a 7-passenger family hauler with chrome everywhere, a cargo area big enough for a weekend's worth of luggage, and 275 supercharged horsepower under the hood. Honestly, That made it one of the fastest station wagons on American roads in 1957, and almost nobody knew it. Automotive historian Richard Langworth later wrote that while these cars were not truly Packards, they were nonetheless very good Studebakers. That is probably the most honest compliment a Packard baker was ever going to get. 1958 Studebaker Golden Hawk. In 1958, America was in a genuine recession. Industry-wide car sales dropped hard, and even General Motors was losing tens of thousands of orders. Studebaker, already weaker than the Big Three for years, got hit harder than most. Budgets tightened, plants ran at reduced capacity, and the future of the entire brand was growing murkier by the month. In the middle of all that, the 1958 Golden Hawk kept rolling off the line with the same supercharged 289 cubic inch V8, producing 275 horsepower. The exact same formula as 1957, unchanged in any meaningful way. Still fast, still handsome, still one of the most interesting cars Studebaker had ever built. The problem was, almost nobody was buying it anymore. Only 878 units were produced in 1958, compared to 4,356 just 1 year earlier. That number says everything. After 1958, the Golden Hawk nameplate was retired entirely and quietly disappeared from the catalog without any formal announcement. What makes that genuinely sad is that the car's design, shaped by the Raymond Loewy School of Industrial Styling, remained one of the cleanest and most proportionally balanced shapes Studebaker ever put on the road. Looking at a 1958 Golden Hawk today, it is hard to believe this came from a company that was financially on its knees. The car shows no signs of desperation whatsoever. It was built with the full confidence of a brand at the top of its game, even though the reality at the time was anything but. The 1958 market did not care about any of that, and the Golden Hawk paid the price with its own disappearance. 1957 Studebaker Golden Hawk. In 1956, the Golden Hawk ran a Packard 352 cubic inch V8 with 275 horsepower. That made it one of the fastest cars on American roads that year. In real-world road tests, it beat the Corvette, the Thunderbird, and the Chrysler 300B in a straight line. Studebaker had every reason to be proud, right up until 1957, when the Packard engine plant closed and everything changed. Studebaker now had to replace that Packard V8 with the biggest engine it owned, a 289 cubic inch V8 that produced 225 horsepower in naturally aspirated form. That was exactly 50 horsepower short of the year before. In the car business of the 1950s, that kind of gap was not something you could paper over, especially for a car being positioned as the brand's flagship performance model. Studebaker's answer was to bolt a McCulloch VS57 supercharger onto the 289, drop the compression ratio to 7.8 to 1 to keep detonation in check, and limit boost to 5 pounds per square inch. The goal was not maximum peak power, it was to broaden the torque curve across the RPM range so the car felt strong and responsive in real driving conditions. The result was 275 horsepower at 4,800 revolutions per minute and 333 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 revolutions per minute, matching the outgoing Packard V8's numbers almost exactly. The automotive press of the time did not hold back. At 0.95 horsepower per cubic inch, this was one of the highest ratios of any mass-production American car in 1957. Both road and track and motor trend placed it among the fastest cars an ordinary buyer could purchase with ordinary money. The 1957 Golden Hawk did not just hold its ground against the year before. By several technical measures, it actually came out ahead. 4,356 units were built that year. Every single one came with that supercharger as standard equipment, at no extra cost to the buyer. That is something Studebaker never promoted aggressively enough, because it was a genuinely clever piece of engineering that most people never gave them credit for. And now we get to Ford. The story gets stranger here, because Ford did not just build one supercharged car. They created one of the rarest factory performance options in American automotive history, and they did it almost entirely because of NASCAR. 1957 Ford Fairlane F-Code. In 1957, Ford was running a supercharger program aimed primarily at conquering NASCAR. To meet homologation requirements, they needed to produce enough supercharged cars for the public to actually buy. Rather than limit the engine to a single model, Ford advertised the F-Code as available across any model in the lineup, including the Fairlane, a mass-market family car that was selling close to 800,000 units a year. The Fairlane F-Code ran the same 312 cubic inch V8 with a Paxton VR57 supercharger, good for 300 horsepower. Compression was held at 8.5 to 1, so the car could run on regular pump gas without needing special fuel, because Ford wanted everyday buyers to be able to drive it without any complications. This was the most powerful engine Ford sold in 1957, sitting under the hood of a family sedan that your neighbor might have parked next to you without either of you knowing what it was. The rarest variant in the Fairlane F-Code lineup was the Skyliner, the model with the fully retractable metal hardtop roof, one of the most mechanically complex features Detroit had ever put on a consumer car at that point. Combining the retractable roof mechanism with the F-Code supercharged engine, fewer than 20 are estimated to have been built in that configuration. Finding one intact today is essentially impossible. Total Fairlane production in 1957 was 785,886 units. The F-Code cars were an almost invisible fraction of that, barely traceable in Ford's official production records. The Thunderbird F-Code gets most of the collector attention because of the name attached to it, but the Fairlane F-Code tells the more interesting story about how Ford actually deployed its supercharger program into the real world. 1957 Ford Thunderbird F-Code. The story starts with NASCAR. In 1957, Ford wanted to dominate the racing circuit with a new supercharged engine, but to get that engine approved for competition, NASCAR required it to appear on enough production cars for the public to purchase. Robert McNamara, then head of the Ford division, proposed a minimum production run of 100 units. The final mandate called for 65 Ford Custom two-door sedans, 20 convertibles, and 15 Thunderbirds, all with a supercharged engine. All 15 of those Thunderbirds, known as the Phase 1D/F cars, were hand-assembled at the Dearborn plant on a single day, January 25, 1957. Each one came with a 312 cubic inch V8 fitted with a McCulloch VR57 Phase 1 supercharger, a heavy-duty 3-speed manual gearbox, seat belts, and a fiberglass hardtop, completely stripped down, not a gram of unnecessary chrome anywhere, because these were cars built for one purpose only, and they delivered. At Daytona Speed Week in 1957, a Phase 1 Thunderbird set a new American sports car record at 138.755 miles per hour, 6 miles per hour faster than the previous year's mark. That was enough for Ford to believe they were onto something real. After the Phase 1 batch, Ford made the F-Code available as a genuine production option. The street version used a Paxton VR57 supercharger on the same 312 cubic inch V8, rated at 300 horsepower in street trim and 340 horsepower in race configuration. The F-Code package was not just a blower bolted on and called it a day. It came with a heavy-duty radiator, high-performance cylinder heads, reinforced engine internals, and a special camshaft. Out of the 21,380 Thunderbirds produced in 1957, approximately 200 were F-Code cars. Original sticker price was around $4,815. Clean examples today regularly clear 6 figures at auction, and the Phase 1 cars are in a completely different category altogether, with one selling in 2011 for $260,000. But here's where the story turns bitter. NASCAR banned the supercharger early in 1957, before any of these cars had competed in a single official race. The Automobile Manufacturers Association then issued a blanket ban on factory-supported racing, and Ford had no choice but to walk away. The entire supercharger program was shut down before it ever got to prove itself on track. The engineering effort, the cars, the Daytona record, all of it became the story of something that should have happened but never got the chance. Of the original 15 Phase 1 Thunderbirds, only 8 are known to survive today. 1958 Packard Hawk, the last car to ever carry the Packard name. It is also the fastest Packard ever built. To understand why that matters, you need to know who Packard used to be. Before World War II, Packard was the American luxury car that wealthy buyers dreamed about, standing alongside Cadillac and Lincoln at the very top of the domestic market and regularly mentioned in the same breath as Rolls-Royce in conversations about the world's finest automobiles. Their slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," remains one of the most famous lines in American automotive advertising history. But by 1958, Packard was no longer Packard. The brand was putting its badge on Studebakers built in South Bend and calling them its own. The 1958 Packard Hawk was built on the Studebaker Golden Hawk platform, but designer Duncan McRae did enough to set it apart from its Studebaker sibling. The nose was reskinned in fiberglass with an entirely new grille treatment. The deck lid featured a sculpted spare tire impression, a styling detail that not everyone loved, but nobody could call timid. Inside, the cabin was finished in full leather with upholstery that rolled up and over the door tops, a detail borrowed from high-end aircraft and custom boat interiors of the era. The instrument panel included a tachometer alongside boost and vacuum gauges, so the driver could monitor exactly what the supercharger was doing at any given moment. Packard called it the most exclusive car in America in its advertising materials, and at $3,995, they were not entirely wrong. Under the hood was a Studebaker 289 cubic inch V8 with a McCulloch supercharger producing 275 horsepower and 333 foot-pounds of torque. 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 9 seconds, top speed around 125 miles per hour, numbers that put the Hawk among the quickest cars available to American buyers in 1958. Most of the 588 units produced came with the Borg-Warner Flight-O-Matic automatic, but around 28 were ordered with the T85 3-speed manual with overdrive. Those manual cars are now the most sought-after Packard Hawks in the collector world. When one comes to market, it does not stay there long. Packard ceased production entirely on July 13, 1958. Those 588 Hawks were all that remained of a 60-year-old brand that had once defined what American luxury meant for decades. The 1958 Packard Hawk was not a perfect car. Borrowed body, borrowed engine, and a name in the process of disappearing forever. But the people who drove it in 1958 knew they were sitting behind the wheel of something genuinely fast, genuinely well-made, and something that was never going to be built again. 1950 to 1951, Crosley. We're starting with a name most Americans don't remember anymore, Crosley. Powell Crosley wasn't a car guy. He was known for radios, refrigerators, and the Cincinnati Reds. But after World War II, he decided to get into the automobile business. At first, things looked promising. In 1948, Crosley sold nearly 29,000 cars, a respectable number for a small company nobody saw coming. The problem was the engine. Crosley used what they called the Cobra, short for copper brazed, an engine block built from steel and copper brazed together rather than cast iron in the traditional way. The technology came out of World War II, where the U.S. Navy used it in generators running at steady speeds and consistent temperatures. In that environment, it worked fine. But a car engine doesn't run at steady speeds. It accelerates, decelerates, heats up, and cools down constantly throughout the day. Under those conditions, electrolysis between the copper and steel started eating through the cylinder walls from the inside. The antifreeze of that era still contained salt, which made the whole process happen even faster. Crosley tried galvanizing as a fix, but it didn't hold. Eventually, they had to take back thousands of failed engines and replace them at no charge, a massive expense for a company with no financial cushion. They switched to a cast iron block in 1949, but the reputation was already gone. Sales collapsed to 7,400 units, a 75% drop in a single year. Crosley stopped making cars in 1952. The lesson here is about as basic as engineering gets. The right technology in the wrong environment is still a failure. 1953 to 54, Hudson Jet. By the early 1950s, Hudson was in a tough spot. Their full-size lineup was looking increasingly dated, and the big three were aggressively moving to modern overhead valve V8. Hudson knew they needed to do something. They decided to launch an all-new compact car called the Jet. To do it, they spent $16 million, every last dollar of the company's cash reserves. Betting everything on an unproven product in an untested market was already a serious risk. But Hudson also made a series of compounding technical mistakes on top of that. The engine they chose was an inline-six, 202 cubic inches, rated at just 104 horsepower, derived from their own aging straight-8, while Chevrolet and Oldsmobile were selling modern overhead valve V8. The Jet's wheelbase was only 105 inches, 14 inches shorter than the Wasp and a full 19 inches shorter than the Hornet. Then, management added a strange design requirement. The car had to be tall enough for a man wearing a hat to sit comfortably inside. The result was a car with awkward proportions that looked like a shrunken Dodge that someone had sat on. Then there was the price. The Jet started at $1,858, while a full-size Chevrolet went for $1,613 and a full-size Ford for $1,734. There was simply no good reason for a customer to choose a smaller car with a higher price tag and an older engine. The Jet sold just 21,000 units in 1953. Instead of bringing in new customers, it mostly pulled buyers away from Hudson's own Wasp lineup. Hudson ended the year with a net loss of $10.4 million after turning an $8 million profit in 1952. By 1954, Hudson had no choice but to merge with Nash, and the Hudson name disappeared shortly after. 1954. Nash Metropolitan. The Nash Metropolitan looked like an oversized toy car with two-tone paint and a rounded body unlike anything else on the American market at the time, and Nash marketed it as a practical, affordable second car for American families. That pitch made sense on paper, right up until you looked at what they were actually delivering to customers. The car wasn't built in America. Nash contracted with the Austin factory in Birmingham, England, using off-the-shelf components from the Austin A40 because domestic tooling costs were too high. That meant American buyers received a car built to British road standards, with a 3-speed manual transmission that had first gear permanently locked out. The driver could not use first gear under any circumstances. Then there were the structural problems. The wheelbase was only 85 inches, the unibody was lightweight, and the center of gravity was high relative to the wheel track. Edmunds described the Metropolitan as a car that handled worryingly in corners, and the only reason it didn't tip over was that the 1.2-liter 42-horsepower engine couldn't push it fast enough to get there. In 1954, Chevrolet was selling overhead valve V8. Nash was selling 42 horsepower out of a factory in England. The early models didn't even come with a trunk. Nash added one later as an option after getting enough complaints from buyers. They produced 11,198 units in 1954, and the Metropolitan never came close to the growth numbers Nash had projected when they signed the contract with Austin. 1957 Plymouth Belvedere. In 1957, the Plymouth Belvedere was one of the most striking cars Detroit had ever produced. Virgil Exner's forward-look design, with towering rear fins and a lower roofline than anything else on the American market, brought customers into dealerships in a way Chrysler hadn't seen in years. The company's market share jumped from 17 to 21% in a single year. The problem was that the entire 1957 Chrysler lineup, Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, Chrysler, and Imperial, had all been pushed to market a full year ahead of schedule. The engineers hadn't had enough time to work through the most basic production issues. The consequences were documented in detail by Allpar. Body panels started rusting within months of leaving the factory, across every model in the lineup. Windshields leaked at both A-pillars. The torsion bars, which Chrysler had just introduced as a major engineering advancement, snapped and left cars leaning hard to one side. Paint peeled off in large sheets. Seat springs punched through upholstery. Door handles broke under normal use. Rearview mirrors vibrated constantly. Door locks froze in winter. Interior trim fell off on its own. One customer wrote to his dealer, "Thank you very much. I slammed the door on my fingers and didn't feel a thing." Chrysler had to shut down the assembly line for several weeks for emergency repairs, something that had never happened before in Detroit. Engineers scrambled to patch problems with temporary fixes, rubber plugs stuffed into windshield gaps, protective caps added to torsion bars, thicker upholstery installed as a Band-Aid. By 1958, when word had spread, sales of Dodge, DeSoto, and Chrysler dropped sharply while Ford and GM held relatively steady. It took Chrysler years to recover the quality reputation they had built over 3 decades, all because of the decision to ship 1 year too soon. 1958 Ford Edsel. Ford started planning the Edsel in 1954. 9 years of market research, hundreds of consumer surveys, and $350 million, roughly $3.6 billion in today's money. The goal was to sell between 100,000 and 200,000 units per year. The Edsel launched on September 4, 1957, backed by the largest teaser advertising campaign in American automotive history up to that point. Ford kept the car completely hidden until reveal day. The most heavily promoted feature was Teletouch Drive, a push-button gear selector built into the center of the steering wheel hub rather than a conventional shift lever. About 95% of all 1958 Edsels left the factory with this system because it was by far the most popular option across the entire lineup. The way Teletouch worked was through a small electric motor that physically shifted the transmission when the driver pressed a button. The problem was that all the relays and electrical contacts for the system were mounted underneath the car, right next to the exhaust pipe. Heat from the exhaust constantly burned out the motor and corroded the contacts. Ford was aware of this and offered a heat shield as a fix, but most dealers didn't reinstall it after each repair visit. Cars got stuck in gear, refused to shift, or change gears unexpectedly while moving. Replacing the Teletouch motor cost $350 each time, and it failed regularly. Ford quietly dropped Teletouch after just 1 year of production. The Edsel sold a total of 118,287 units across 26 months on the market, spanning 18 different models. The rarest of all was the 1960 Ranger convertible, with only 76 built. The final loss came to $350 million, and the Edsel became a permanent shorthand for failure in American business. 1958 Buick Limited. In 1958, Buick decided to build the most expensive and ambitious car in the company's history. They called it the Limited, a nameplate that hadn't been used since the early 1940s. It was longer than the already sizable Roadmaster, with an extra 8 inches added to the rear overhang. Underneath all that chrome were 2 brand-new technologies that Buick had poured serious money into developing. The first was air poise suspension, an airbag system that replaced conventional coil springs at all 4 corners with vinyl rubber bladders. GM rolled it out across their entire premium lineup in 1958. The bladders deflated on their own, the compressors failed repeatedly, and the cars started leaning in unpredictable directions. Tom McKay Hill, the veteran automotive journalist from Mechanics Illustrated, publicly ridiculed GM over the problem in print. Chevrolet and Oldsmobile dropped the system after just 1 year. Buick and Pontiac held on for 2 years before giving up, and Cadillac tried to push through until 1960. GM quietly shipped conversion kits back to coil springs to every dealership across the country, free of charge for any customer who asked, but never publicly acknowledged that the system had failed. The second was the flight pitch Dynaflow, a triple turbine transmission that Buick spent $86 million developing. It was the first time Buick had worked with complex aluminum casting at full production scale, and the process left a number of unresolved bugs when the car went to market. The most serious one: if a driver used the grade retard mode for too long, the transmission destroyed itself. Buick's owner documentation didn't warn people clearly enough. 2 years later, Buick quietly renamed it the triple turbine and fixed the issues internally without any explanation. Most flight pitch cars were eventually converted to the older twin turbine by their owners because almost no shop was willing to work on something that complicated. The Buick Limited lasted exactly one model year before it was discontinued. 1958 Lincoln Continental, Mark III. In 1958, Ford set out to take on Cadillac directly with an all-new Lincoln. The Continental Mark III was the longest and heaviest unibody car ever mass-produced in the world at that point, nearly 19 feet from bumper to bumper, weighing roughly 5,000 pounds and returning around 9 miles per gallon. The problems showed up before the car even reached customers. When the first prototype ran tests at the Wixom assembly plant, the frame cracked. Welds came apart, the car shook badly, and during one test run the body actually buckled in the middle. The root cause was that the Lincoln engineering team and the Continental engineering team had worked in isolation throughout the entire development process. Lincoln had no experience building a unibody structure at this size, and nobody inside the company flagged the problem early enough to do anything useful about it. The solution they came up with was to add 200 pounds of steel gussets to reinforce the frame. The tooling was already set, the launch date wasn't moving, and Ford shipped the car knowing the underlying problem hadn't been properly fixed. In the real world, chassis and suspension components sometimes failed without warning while the car was being driven, leaving owners stranded on the side of the road waiting for a tow. Ford lost money on every single unit sold because production costs were so high. Meanwhile, Cadillac outsold Lincoln by nearly 3 to 1 in the same price bracket. The car's designer was John Najjar, and Najjar was fired shortly after launch. Ford's own engineers later referred to these cars internally as the phony marks. Lincoln came close to being shut down entirely before the 1961 Continental arrived and pulled the brand back from the edge. 1958 Oldsmobile 98. The 1958 Oldsmobile 98 was the top of the Oldsmobile lineup, the most expensive car the brand offered, built for buyers who wanted the best GM had to give. GM equipped it with air ride suspension, a system that Cadillac had originally developed in 1957 before GM decided to roll it out across their entire premium lineup for 1958. Buick, Oldsmobile, Chevrolet, and Pontiac all received the same system in the same year. The vinyl rubber air bladders deflated after a few months of regular use. The compressors that maintained pressure failed constantly. Cars started leaning to one side or the other, depending on which bladder gave out first. Oldsmobile 98 owners would walk out to their garage in the morning and find their car sitting tilted on the concrete, not from any accident, but because the suspension had quietly deflated overnight. A member of the ClassicOldsmobile.com forum put it simply, GM dealers were converting these cars back to conventional springs almost as fast as they came off the showroom floor. GM responded by shipping conversion kits back to conventional coil springs to every dealership in the country, arriving on pallets with all the parts needed, ready to be installed free of charge for any customer who asked. Chevrolet and Oldsmobile pulled the plug after exactly 1 year. Buick and Pontiac held on for another year before doing the same. Cadillac was the only GM brand that tried to stick with the system through 1960, with results no different from the others. GM sent the kits out quietly and offered no explanation. This wasn't the failure of one car or one division. It was the result of a decision made at the top of the corporation and pushed down onto every car in the lineup at the same time.
The 1954 to 1955 Chevrolet Nomad. The story of the Nomad began in 1954 when Chevrolet introduced it as a concept car at the GM Motorama show in New York. From its very first appearance, the Nomad drew major attention because it looked completely different from the familiar image of a wagon at the time. Instead of a boxy shape focused on hauling cargo, the Nomad presented a low, long, sleek image full of show car flair. The response was so positive that Chevrolet quickly decided to put it into commercial production for the 1955 model year. Of course, in order to make mass production possible, some details had to change. The original concept used fiberglass, while the production version switched to steel to better suit manufacturing realities. The car used Chevrolet's standard passenger car chassis with a 115-inch wheelbase, but the upper body was designed in a distinctive way, creating an identity that almost no other wagon at the time could match. The greatest part of the Nomad's appeal lay in its exterior design. The most striking detail was the center pillar, or B-pillar, leaning forward, a very bold styling solution that made the car look as if it were moving even when standing still. Behind that was a wide expanse of side glass, combined with bright chrome bars running across the tailgate, creating a look that was both luxurious and deeply futuristic. The entire car felt like a refined blend between a sporty hardtop and a practical wagon, and that very blend was what made the Nomad different. The Nomad was not only beautiful, but also very clever in terms of functionality. Thanks to its large glass area, the car offered a sense of nearly 360-degree visibility, making the cabin feel brighter, airier, and far more modern than many wagons of the same era. Its two-door, six-passenger configuration was also a fairly rare combination in the 1950s, when most wagons usually prioritized pure utility over personality. The rear seat could be folded down, adding about 11 inches of cargo area length, showing that Chevrolet did not sacrifice practicality just to achieve style. From a market standpoint, the Nomad was also a very special vehicle. The list price of the V8 version was $2,571 placing it among the most expensive Chevrolets of that time. This made it very clear that the Nomad was not created to be a mass-market wagon for everyone, but rather an image-driven product, intended for people who wanted something far more distinctive than an ordinary family car. And despite being widely praised for its design, 1955 production stopped at just 8,386 units. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the American truck market had a very clear gap. Compact pickups were nimble, but often seen as too weak for heavier jobs. Meanwhile, full-size trucks were too big, too bulky, and not everyone wanted to trade everyday maneuverability for excess towing and hauling capability. And then the Dodge Dakota appeared, like an answer that until then almost no one had truly dared to offer. In overall concept, the Safari followed the same direction as the Nomad, combining the sleek appearance of a hardtop with the usefulness of a wagon. But Pontiac did not simply copy that formula. From the beltline downward, the Safari's body had its own distinct design, showing that this was not just a Chevrolet with a different badge, but a wagon that truly had Pontiac's own identity. The front end was where that difference showed most clearly. The Safari had a longer nose, giving it a more graceful and luxurious feel from the very first glance. Dominating the front was Pontiac's signature split bumper grille, a detail that was both strong and instantly recognizable. On the hood was the famous Silver Streak chrome strip, a design signature that had been tied to Pontiac's image for many years. The car was equipped with a wraparound windshield, which made the front end look more modern and open. The ribbed roof added visual depth, while also giving this wagon the appearance of something almost like a show car. Along the sides, the sliding rear side windows not only increased practicality, but also became an upscale detail, showing that Pontiac paid close attention to the passenger experience, not just the exterior appearance. In terms of price, the Safari also reflected its upscale positioning very clearly. At $2,962, it became Pontiac's most expensive model in 1955. That was a very notable figure, because it showed that Pontiac did not view the Safari as a side product in the lineup, but as an image car, a statement of modern lifestyle. However, that high price and its rather specialized nature also meant the Safari was not a model for the masses. total production reached only 3,760 units, far lower than the Chevrolet Nomad. The 1955 DeSoto Firedome station wagon. To understand why this car was special, it is necessary to look back at the context of the mid-1950s. This was the period when American automakers were entering a major transformation in design. Cars no longer carried the tall, boxy, and heavy look of the early part of the decade. Instead, Detroit began moving toward the trend of bodies that were lower, longer, and wider, combined with large glass areas, bright chrome, and styling inspiration drawn from the jet age. And the DeSoto Firedome station wagon was a product that reflected that spirit very clearly. Compared with earlier wagons that were often seen as stretched cargo boxes, the 1955 DeSoto Firedome had an appearance that was far more graceful and stylish. The new body was redesigned to create a longer, sleeker feel, while the wraparound windshield made the front end look much more modern. Within DeSoto's 1955 lineup, the Firedome station wagon held a very special position because it was the only wagon the brand offered that year. That made it not only rare in terms of production, but also representative of the way DeSoto viewed the wagon segment as a whole. And that sense of luxury did not come only from its styling, but also from what lay under the hood. The Firedome name was closely tied to DeSoto's notable V8 engines during this period, giving this wagon far more technical appeal than its calm exterior might suggest. From a commercial standpoint, the DeSoto Firedome station wagon was clearly not a car for the masses. Its $3,170 list price placed it among the upscale wagons of that era, meaning it was significantly more expensive than many mainstream family cars. At that price, only 1,803 units were produced, a number so small that the Firedome station wagon has today almost become a secret name even among many classic car enthusiasts. Is the 1956 Ford Parklane. What made the Parklane interesting was that it was not built as a completely separate model, but instead developed from Ford's two-door ranch wagon platform. However, rather than keeping the look of a mainstream wagon unchanged, Ford upgraded it with trim details and the spirit of the Fairlane line, which was a more upscale and stylish line in the company's lineup. That combination created a very special wagon. It still retained the usefulness of the ranch wagon, but had the appearance and atmosphere of a far more premium car. Inside the cabin, the Parklane continued to show its ambition to rise above the image of a purely utilitarian wagon. The car was equipped with full carpeting, giving it a more finished and luxurious feel compared with the utility-focused flooring of many mainstream wagons. The ribbed trim panels on the roof pillars also helped make the interior feel more elaborate, creating the sense that the buyer was paying not only for space, but also for the experience. This was very important, because in the second half of the 1950s, American automakers increasingly understood that the interior was exactly where customers felt the difference most clearly between an ordinary car and an upscale one. In terms of size, the Parklane used a 115.5-inch wheelbase and had an overall length of 197.6 inches. Those figures show that this was a car large enough to meet the needs of the post-war American family, while still maintaining balanced proportions so it did not become visually too heavy. It had enough presence to create a sense of value, yet was still compact enough to preserve the youthful character of a two-door wagon. Under the hood, the Parklane was equipped with a 292 cubic inch V8, a choice that suited this model's positioning very well. Output reached 200 horsepower with the manual transmission, or 202 horsepower with the Ford-O-Matic automatic transmission. Those numbers were entirely respectable in 1956 for a family wagon. The most notable thing about the Parklane, however, lay in its commercial performance. This model was produced for only a single model year, 1956, which gave it more the character of a special project than a long-running product line. But despite its short lifespan, the Parklane still reached sales of 15,186 units, a very impressive figure that even surpassed the Chevrolet Nomad's sales in the same year. The Oldsmobile Fiesta. This was not only a beautiful wagon from Oldsmobile, but also a milestone showing that the brand had returned to the station wagon segment in a very impressive way after many years of absence. That return carried considerable significance. Oldsmobile had not truly maintained a notable presence in the wagon market since 1950, and it was not until 1957 that the brand came back in a clearer way. But instead of simply launching a safe and predictable wagon, Oldsmobile chose to return with a model that fully captured the spirit of the late 1950s. Modern, glossy, and filled with enough design elements to make buyers feel that they were not just choosing a family car, but choosing a lifestyle. One of the things that made the Fiesta stand out most was its hardtop body style without a center pillar, meaning there was no fixed pillar between the side windows. When all the glass was rolled down, the car created a feeling that was far more open, spacious, and seamless than a traditional wagon. On top of that, Oldsmobile at this stage already had a very strong image thanks to the reputation of its Rocket V8 line, so the Fiesta benefited greatly from that brand foundation as well. When people think of 1950s Oldsmobile, they think not only of comfort, but also of technical progress, strong engines, and a modern feel. So even though the Fiesta was a wagon, it still carried a spirit that was very distinctive to Oldsmobile. Not simply roomy, but also meant to suggest quickness, advancement, and full confidence. Another interesting detail in the Fiesta's story was that this model was built by Mitchell Bentley in Michigan. That gave it an added layer of special value, because the name Mitchell Bentley suggests bodies finished with a higher level of care than ordinary mass production. In total, the company sold 19,800 wagons, including the Super 88, Golden Rocket 88, and Fiesta sedan lines, a figure large enough to break the brand's entire wagon sales record from 1946 to 1950 combined. In terms of pricing, the Super 88 hardtop carried a price of $3,220, showing that the Fiesta was not a cheap mainstream choice. It was positioned as an upscale wagon, intended for customers who wanted more than basic practicality. As the 1957 Ford Del Rio Ranch wagon, this model was introduced to replace both the Park Lane and the Custom Ranch wagon, meaning Ford no longer separated the stylish wagon as an overly specialized product, but instead gathered that spirit into a car that made more sense in terms of price and positioning. The audience Ford targeted with the Del Rio was young families, people who needed a versatile vehicle for everyday life but still wanted it to look sharp, modern, and give them a sense of pride when parked in front of the house. In terms of appearance, the Del Rio Ranch wagon very clearly carried the spirit of 1957 American design, one of the most dazzling years for styling in the entire decade. The car featured an anodized gold V-shaped side trim, a detail that was both eye-catching and highly distinctive. At the front were eyebrow details above the headlights, giving the face a sharper look and greater visual depth. At the rear, the car had tail fins that were true to the era, reminding viewers that this was a period when Detroit was obsessed with styling language inspired by aviation and the jet age. Even the sliding rear side windows were not only useful in practical terms, but also helped make the car look more modern and upscale. And beyond its styling, the Del Rio also scored strongly in terms of functionality. Ford promoted this model as a companion for both work and playtime, a phrase that perfectly matched the spirit of post-war America. Families could use it for weekend trips, carrying picnic gear, sports equipment, luggage, or even items needed for everyday work. When the seat was folded down and the tailgate lowered, the cargo area could reach nearly 9 feet in length, an extremely impressive figure. It was exactly that balance between styling and practicality that helped the Del Rio achieve major commercial success. While many stylish wagons were often limited by high prices or overly narrow positioning, the Del Rio reached a much broader group of customers. As a result, production climbed to 46,105 units, an extremely impressive figure, and most notably, it outsold the Chevrolet Nomad that same year by nearly 40,000 units. The 1968 Charger RT came standard with the 440 Magnum engine, a big block machine more than enough to turn the car into a straight-line monster. For those who still did not find that enough, Dodge also offered the 426 Hemi as an option, the very thing that turned the Charger into a true legend in the muscle car world. This was not just a coupe that was beautiful to look at. It had real power, real presence, and the ability to turn its aggressive appearance into genuine performance. That was expressed very clearly through its body proportions and technical foundation. The Caballero used a long 122-inch wheelbase, a figure sufficient to place it among the large and luxurious wagons of that era. The body was supplied by Ionia Manufacturing, a name long associated with many upscale wagons for GM. That detail added even more to the sense that the Caballero was not an ordinary mass-produced wagon, but a product carefully crafted with special attention given to its bodywork and overall finish. In terms of appearance, the Caballero had everything people expected from a late 1950s Buick. The body was large, long, and glossy, with abundant chrome and lines full of presence. Under the hood was a 364 cubic inch V8, producing 300 horsepower, an extremely impressive figure for a wagon in 1957. This was a very notable detail because it showed that Buick did not view wagons as a segment that had to accept weaker performance. On the contrary, the Caballero was given a powertrain fully worthy of its upscale position. Paired with that engine was the variable pitch Dynaflow automatic transmission, which came standard. This was also a very Buick detail, because Dynaflow was always associated with a philosophy of smooth, gentle, and relaxed operation rather than hard-edged sportiness. The interior space continued to reinforce that upscale image. The car was equipped with two-tone vinyl seats, a choice that was both fashionable and carried a very characteristic late 1950s sense of luxury. Even the rear cargo area had thick carpeting, showing that Buick did not view it as merely a place to store things. Every area inside the car was meant to feel carefully finished, clean, and refined. The Caballero's price only reinforced that point. At $3,831 US, it became the most expensive model in the Century line. But even though that price certainly limited the number of customers, the Caballero still reached production of 10,186 units, a result strong enough to prove that there was still a group of buyers willing to pay for a truly luxurious wagon. 1956 Buick Century. The name Century was originally created with the implication that this car was capable of hitting the 100 miles per hour mark. And by 1956, Buick had truly turned that promise into an exhilarating experience. The essence of the Century is very interesting. Buick took the chassis platform of the Special Series, which was lightweight and had a short wheelbase, only 122 inches, and placed within it the heart of a 322 cubic inch V8 engine, producing up to 255 horsepower. What was the result? You get a car carrying the full DNA of Buick, shiny with luxurious chrome strips, a grand interior, yet possessing the explosive power of a hidden track athlete. Don't let this somewhat mature appearance fool you. In tests from that era, the Century took only about 9.6 seconds to accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour and could reach a top speed exceeding 110 miles per hour. For a heavy family car in the mid-50s, these are extremely impressive numbers. It is the perfect model for gentlemen who want a truly decisive highway merge, making the cars next to them look on in amazement, while they themselves remain sitting comfortably on the plushest cushions. 1956 Plymouth Fury. If you are a car enthusiast, the name Fury surely brings to mind images of power and a touch of aggression. But let's go back to 1956. This was the very year the first Fury was born. At that time, the Fury was not yet a separate model line. It was actually a special high-performance hardtop version, developed based on the two-door Belvedere model. But don't let that reliance mislead you, because Plymouth poured all of its finest essence into this car. This was the era of the forward-look design language under the talented hands of Virgil Exner. The 1956 Fury embodied that style with a look that was lower, longer, and more attractive than any competitor in its segment. To create absolute distinction, Plymouth offered only a single color choice. The entire body was painted eggshell white with gold metallic accent strips running along the sides. Under the hood was a 303 cubic inch V8 heart, producing 240 horsepower. At that time, Plymouth proudly declared this as the most powerful engine the company had ever built. This power helped the Fury accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9.2 seconds, a figure enough to excite drivers of that era. But what truly made the Fury successful was the price. For only about $2,866, Americans at that time could own a car with performance approaching that of a race car without having to enter the world of expensive ultra-luxury lines. With over 4,400 units sold in the very first year, the Fury asserted its position as a formidable challenger. 1956 Chevrolet 210. In Chevrolet's 1956 product lineup, if the 150 model was the ultimate economy version, while the Bel Air was the symbol of flashiness, then the 210 model sat exactly in the middle. It was for pragmatic people, those who wanted a car nicer than the base model but did not want to spend too much money on excessive trim pieces. But don't let that mid-range position fool you. In 1956, Chevrolet gave the 210 series a new look with a bold front end and cleaner side moldings, helping it no longer be bland but instead become very tasteful and complete. What truly turned this car into a memorable name was the legendary small block V8 engine option. With a 265 cubic inch engine producing 205 horsepower, the Chevrolet 210 was suddenly completely transformed. Although the 3-speed manual transmission remained the standard for those who liked control, this power was enough to turn a seemingly ordinary car into one full of life. Real-world tests of that era recorded staggering numbers, accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 9 seconds, completing the 1/4 mile in 16.6 seconds, and reaching a top speed of up to 111 miles per hour. 1956 Chrysler 300B. The Chrysler 300B was the second model in the legendary Letter series, following the resounding success of the 1955 C300. If its predecessor was a challenging opening statement, then the 300B was a confident upgrade, asserting Chrysler's position on the high-performance car map. The appearance of the 300B carried the true aura of a gentleman. Long, wide, a clean design, and extremely luxurious. But behind that poised look was one of the most formidable machines in America in 1956. The heart of the car was the renowned 354 Hemi Fif 8 engine. With a standard output of 340 horsepower and an option of up to 355 horsepower, this was no longer just fast enough for fun, but the kind of power created to dominate highway miles. A test by Hot Rod magazine at the time recorded an acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9 seconds, an extremely impressive figure for a large and heavy coupe. Even more notably, in 1956, the 300B also became the fastest stock car at Daytona with a record speed of 139.37 miles per hour right on the sand. What made the 300B different was the way it defined performance. It was not just fast, but fast in true American Grand Touring style, large, imposing, and luxurious, yet still capable of running extremely fast with surprising stability. With a production of only 1,102 units shipped, it became a rare icon, proving that even a large luxury coupe could become a machine that made the entire market wary. 1956 Ford Thunderbird. Ford understood very well that the majority of American customers at that time were not truly looking for a harsh European-style roadster. Instead, they craved a car that was both sporty and gorgeously beautiful, yet comfortable enough for daily use. That was the reason the Ford Thunderbird was born, and by 1956, Ford had truly perfected this successful formula with extremely clever refinements. The most recognizable feature of the 1956 version was the spare tire moved to the rear in Continental style, helping to expand trunk space, a practical element rarely seen on sports cars. In particular, the removable hardtop was supplemented with characteristic circular porthole windows. This detail not only helped improve visibility for the driver, but also inadvertently became a classic visual hallmark, making the car more fashionable than ever. Under the hood, the 1956 Thunderbird was powerfully upgraded with the 312 Thunderbird Special V8 engine. Depending on the configuration, this engine could produce from 215 to 225 horsepower, and there were even special-tuned versions reaching 260 horsepower. With this power, the car could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in less than 9 seconds and reach a top speed of approximately 120 miles per hour. Although it wasn't the most extreme car, the Thunderbird proved that an American sports car could be completely powerful and stylish, yet still extremely easy to live with. With impressive sales of over 15,000 units in 1956, the Thunderbird affirmed its massive appeal. 1956 Dodge D500. Released in late 1955 for the 1956 model year, the Dodge D500 was considered the first true high-performance passenger car that Dodge ever shipped directly from the factory. This was a historic moment, as it marked the point where Dodge no longer stood on the sidelines but officially issued a powerful manifesto that they also wanted to dominate the power race heating up in Detroit. The interesting thing is that the D500 nearly completely retained the appearance of a polite and composed American coupe commonly seen at the time. But hidden behind that low-profile exterior was a comprehensive performance upgrade package. The heart of the D500 was a 315 Hemi Fiv 8 engine, producing 260 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque. To harness this power, Dodge equipped it with a performance camshaft, a 4-barrel carburetor, dual exhaust, while simultaneously upgrading the entire system of springs, shock absorbers, and brakes. The company even proactively lowered the car's chassis by about 1.5 inches to optimize the center of gravity. When stepping on the gas, the D500 immediately showed that it was not an ordinary Dodge. The prestigious Hot Rod magazine of that time once tested and recorded the car accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 8.8 seconds. They even called it the fastest automatic transmission passenger car they had ever tested up to that point. The D500 was particularly important because it signaled a transformation of American automakers. They were no longer just accidentally creating powerful cars, but had begun to actively build specialized performance versions right from the production line. 1956 Studebaker Golden Hawk. In the mid-1950s, while the giants in Detroit were preoccupied with the size race, Studebaker chose a risky, separate path to survival. And the 1956 Golden Hawk was precisely their ambitious answer. A car that did not follow the crowd, did not choose safety, but chose to be truly different to carve its name into history. Regarding design, the Golden Hawk possessed the characteristic sleek appearance of the Hawk line but was pushed to a dramatic new height. With a higher front end, a wide grille, and especially the proud pair of fiberglass tail fins, the car carried a strange hybrid beauty. Having a bit of European flair, yet possessing intense American muscle. It was the type of car that you could not mistake for any other car on the streets at that time. But real power was what made rivals wary. Under the hood was a massive Packard 352 V8 engine, producing 275 horsepower and a maximum torque of up to 380 pound-feet. The key point lay in the weight. The Golden Hawk only weighed about 3,360 pounds, significantly lighter than rivals with similar power output. This advantage helped the car accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in only about 7.8 seconds, a figure enough to place it among the fastest cars in America in 1956. What makes the 1956 version priceless in the eyes of collectors is that this was the only year the Golden Hawk used this Packard engine block. With a limited production of just over 4,000 units, it was not only Studebaker's flagship model, but also a powerful testament that a small automaker could still create one of the most fearsome coupes on the track and the street. 1956 Chevrolet Corvette. Before 1956, the Corvette was like a beautiful but unfinished idea. It had an eye-catching appearance, but lacked the most important thing for a sports car: true performance. Early models using sluggish six-cylinder engines disappointed enthusiasts, and sales were so disastrous that Chevrolet even considered stopping production. But in 1956, everything changed completely with a spectacular transformation. Regarding appearance, the 1956 Corvette was refreshed with a lower, longer, and more confident body. This was the first year the scalloped coves appeared, a classic design detail that defined the Corvette's identity for many years to follow. More importantly, the car finally became practical with roll-up windows and complete exterior door handles, instead of temporary plastic curtains. From here, the Corvette was no longer a half-baked, good-looking toy, but began to become a sports car in its true sense. The most decisive change lay under the hood. Chevrolet completely eliminated the six-cylinder engine. Starting from 1956, every Corvette shipped used a V8 engine by default. The 265 cubic inch small block engine was refined to produce an output from 210 to 240 horsepower, accompanied by a standard 3-speed manual transmission. This change brought a fearsome power. The 225 horsepower version could reach the 0 to 60 miles per hour mark in just 7.3 seconds and a top speed touching the 129 miles per hour threshold. This was the moment an icon was born, a car that was not only beautiful, not only performative, but also fast enough and fierce enough to be worthy of its leading position. Looking back at this list, we see that 1956 was not only about shiny chrome strips. 1955, Lincoln Capri Hardtop Coupe. Lincoln entered 1955 with an image solidified since the early 1950s, thanks to its powerful overhead valve V8 engine and achievements at the Carrera Panamericana race. Lincoln's goal was to maintain its characteristics of durability and high speed, while adding comfort and glamour for luxury car buyers. The Capri sat at the high end of the standard Lincoln lineup, in which the hardtop coupe stood out thanks to its pillarless design, abundant chrome details, and a low roofline that created a sleeker feel than its actual size. The car used a new 341 V8 engine, which only appeared in 1955, producing 225 horsepower and 332 pound-feet of torque. Lincoln switched to its own 3-speed turbodrive automatic transmission instead of the previous Hydra-Matic system, helping the car operate smoother and more modernly. Performance was rated as powerful for a luxury coupe, with a 0 to 60 miles per hour acceleration time of about 12.5 seconds and completing a quarter mile in 18.9 seconds. Although the Capri was beautiful and powerful, 1955 was a disappointing sales year for Lincoln as total production dropped to 27,222 vehicles. But why did a car possessing such good performance fail to explode? In reality, the Capri still accounted for the majority of the company's sales with 23,673 vehicles, proving that customers were still interested in this model line. However, the overall decline showed that the market at the time had begun to grow more demanding and required entirely fresh design languages. 1955 DeSoto Fireflight. DeSoto was originally a stable mid-range brand for the Chrysler Corporation, but 1955 marked a major shift in image. Virgil Exner's forward-look design language brought a lower, longer, and smoother car stance, accompanied by a prominent grille, tall taillights, and clean body lines. In the context of the early 1950s, when the market was still filled with tall, upright car shapes, the Fireflight created a modern feel, as if it were ahead of its time. Sitting at the top of the DeSoto product lineup, the Fireflight utilized a 126-inch wheelbase and had multiple body styles, including the Sportsman two-door hardtop and a spacious four-door sedan. The car's big strength lay in its 291 V8 engine with hemispherical combustion chambers, which helped the intake and exhaust systems breathe better to generate powerful output. This engine produced 200 horsepower and 274 pound-feet of torque. Period testing recorded the four-door sedan accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 12.5 seconds and completing a quarter mile in 19 seconds. DeSoto's advertising campaign called this model line "Styled for Tomorrow" to emphasize the futuristic image of the product. The appeal of the Fireflight lay in the harmonious combination of a long body, low roof, bright chrome details, and modern style, helping the car easily catch attention when looking back today. 1955 Packard Clipper Custom Constellation. In 1955, Packard decided to separate Clipper into a clearer model line to create distance between this line and the high-end Packard models. The upscale Clipper models were positioned as modern, stylish, and somewhat glamorous, but had not quite stepped into the price segment of those Packard senior models. Among them, the Constellation was the standout choice in the Clipper custom family, featuring a pillarless hardtop body style, a clean roofline, and possessing many bright details along with a two-tone paint option. The car used a 122-inch wheelbase, a shipping weight of about 3,865 pounds, and had a list price of around $3,076 US. The car's power came from the new Packard 352 V8 engine block, delivering 245 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. 1955 held a special meaning for Packard because it was the first season of the all-new V8 engine, the first year of a bolder post-war design under Richard Teague, and also the time when the Torsion-level suspension system became standard equipment on the Clipper Custom. Did the combination of these numerous new technologies help the car perform impressively? Testing by Motor Trend magazine recorded the 1955 Clipper Custom accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 11.9 seconds and completing a quarter mile in 18.7 seconds at 74 miles per hour. These were very strong performance figures for a spacious American coupe in the mid-1950s. 1955 Mercury Montclair two-door hardtop. Mercury was originally positioned between Ford and Lincoln, but by 1955 the brand upgraded its image by introducing the Montclair as its top-of-the-line series, sitting above the Monterey. The arrival of the Montclair gave buyers a more luxurious, standout feel without touching the price tag of a true luxury car. Among them, the two-door hardtop was the design star of the model line with a large, confident stance that was full of showmanship. According to brochure documentation from Mercury, the Montclair had a 119-inch wheelbase and an overall length of about 206.3 inches. The car used the Mercury 292 Super Torque V8 engine, helping the Montclair version reach an output of 198 horsepower. The torque level of 286 pound-feet provided a strong feel when the car left the starting line or accelerated on the open road. Mercury continuously emphasized the smoothness and seamless power of this model. Was this just superficial commercial advertising? Period testing showed that the company's claims were completely grounded in reality. Motor Life magazine recorded the 1955 Montclair accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 11.7 seconds and completing a quarter mile in about 18.6 seconds. With a list price of $2,631 for the two-door hardtop version, the Montclair created an attractive choice for a group of customers who wanted to own style, accompanied by good performance power without having to pay the expensive price tag of a Lincoln. 1955 Cadillac Fleetwood 60 Special. Cadillac was already considered the standard of luxury cars in America in the mid-1950s, and the 60 Special occupied a very special position in the product lineup. This model was more upscale and longer than the standard Series 62 sedan series, but had not gone in an extreme direction like the limited Eldorado version. In 1955, Cadillac only lightly updated the design instead of a complete refresh, but the car still maintained a modern look thanks to a wide grille, long body, smooth fender lines, and subtle Fleetwood details. The 60 Special version utilized a wheelbase of up to 133 inches, an overall length of about 227 inches, and weighed around 4,550 pounds. This massive size gave the car a powerful presence on the street even before the engine started. In terms of performance, the car used the Cadillac 331 V8 engine, producing 250 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque, combined with a hydromatic automatic transmission. Do you think a large and formal sedan like this would move sluggishly? In reality, this mechanical power provided the car with better acceleration than many people imagined. Period testing by Motor Life magazine recorded the Fleetwood 60 Special, accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 11.2 seconds and completing a quarter mile in 19.6 seconds. It was the sharp contrast between a luxurious, stately appearance and quite powerful operating performance that created a special appeal for the model. 1955 Oldsmobile Super 88. Oldsmobile had already built a solid reputation thanks to the Rocket V8 engine from before. By 1955, the company sharpened the appearance of its entire product lineup, helping the Super 88 have a stronger competitive position in the showroom. The Super 88 model was ranked above the standard 88 and possessed a more powerful version of the 324 Rocket Dash V8 engine block. This engine block reached an output of 202 horsepower, while the lower 88 versions only used a configuration with weaker power. Thanks to the good combination of new styling and power, Oldsmobile experienced a very successful sales year with the company's total production reaching 583,179 vehicles. The context of America at that time was entering the jet age, where customer tastes shifted toward cars that were lower, wider, brighter, and more modern than the boxy car shapes of the previous period. The Super 88 met this exact trend with a wide grille assembly, many chrome-plated details, and hardtop body styles that the company named Holiday. The real-world performance of the car also proved that this was not a machine with just a flashy outward appearance. A test later recalled by Motor Trend magazine recorded the 1955 Super 88 capable of accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 10.6 seconds. Do you realize that this is a very fast number for an American car with a spacious cabin in the mid-1950s? It was this impressive specification that contributed to solidly reinforcing Oldsmobile's image as one of Detroit's early performance-focused pioneer brands. 1955 Chrysler 300. The Chrysler 300 appeared in February 1955 as a special high-speed Chrysler model. The car combined Virgil Exner's design language, a luxurious leather interior, a stiffer suspension, and a name taken directly from the 300 horsepower output figure. Did you know that in 1955, 300 horsepower was an extremely large number for a mass-produced car in America? Chrysler did not just advertise but also equipped truly serious hardware for this model. The car used a 331 Hemi Fiv 8 engine with two 4-barrel carburetors, a hotter camshaft, a more free-flowing dual exhaust system, and a heavy-duty configuration. The model was officially sold from February 10, 1955, with a base price of around $4,109. Production only reached 1,725 units in the short model year, making the Chrysler 300 a special and rare model. The significance of this car lay not only in its horsepower or low production, but also in its role as an important forward-look symbol for the Chrysler Corporation. In terms of operation, Motor Trend magazine recorded the car accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 10 seconds, completing a quarter mile in 17.6 seconds at 82 miles per hour and reaching a top speed of 128.6 miles per hour. This was a very strong performance level in the context of the American automotive industry during the mid-1950s. 1955 Ford Thunderbird. The 1955 Ford Thunderbird was born because Ford noticed that Americans wanted a model different from the small and rough sports car style. Chevrolet already had the Corvette, but Ford chose its own direction by creating a two-seat car that possessed style, comfort, and enough V8 power for comfortable long-distance driving. The Thunderbird was introduced with a 102-inch wheelbase, sharp lines, a long hood, a short tail, and many signature details. Prominent design highlights included a detachable hardtop, a wraparound windshield, and a spare tire placed in the trunk instead of being mounted on the rear. The clean and balanced shape helped the first Thunderbird carry a feel that was more luxurious than wild. Ford read the market correctly when it produced 16,155 Thunderbirds in its first year, far outselling the Corvette of the same era. All 1955 Thunderbirds used the 292 Y-block V8 engine, but the output varied depending on the transmission. The manual version reached 193 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, while the automatic Ford-O-Matic version reached 198 horsepower and 286 pound-feet. Mechanics Illustrated magazine recorded the 1955 Thunderbird with overdrive accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9.6 seconds and reaching a top speed of about 130 miles per hour. This model proved that a two-seat personal car could be beautiful, comfortable, and fast at the same time, without necessarily being a pure sports car. 1955 Chevrolet Corvette. The 1955 Corvette is considered the model that saved this car line from the risk of becoming a beautiful failure. By the end of 1954, the car possessed an attractive fiberglass design but lacked the speed to match its appearance. The early versions only used a 6-cylinder engine and a 2-speed automatic transmission, causing the car to perform softer than expected. When Ford introduced the Thunderbird, Chevrolet understood that they needed real power immediately. In 1955, the company equipped the Corvette with an all-new 265 V8 engine, using a 4-barrel carburetor, an 8-to-1 compression ratio, and reaching an output of 195 horsepower. This change completely transformed the character of the car, from one with a beautiful exterior but weak performance into a true American sports car. The Dash V8 version had a base price of around $2,909, higher than the 6-cylinder version priced at $2,774. The appearance did not change much, but the company added a special identification lettering on the side to distinguish the more powerful V8 version. Production for 1955 only reached 700 units, making this one of the rarest production years. Do you think an engine change could bring about such a big impact? Car and Driver magazine recorded the V8 version accelerating from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 8.5 seconds and reaching a top speed of 120 miles per hour. This was a giant leap compared to the 6-cylinder version, creating the foundation that helped the Corvette continue to exist and develop into an American sports car icon. 1955 was not only beautiful in terms of design, but was also a turning point in how American automakers viewed performance. If you could choose one to put in your garage, would you choose the Chrysler 300, Thunderbird, Corvette, or a sleeper model like the Cadillac 60 Special? Leave a comment about the most underrated name on the list. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel to see more lists about muscle cars, V8 engines, and rare cars. See you in the next video to continue exploring the history of American speed.